They locked her in at midnight. Vivian Cross didn't bother to hide her smile as she turned the iron bolt. She had done this before. Everyone in Ash Hollow Crossing knew about the tradition, and everyone looked the other way. "Let's see how long the barn rat lasts," she said to the girls behind her, their laughter cutting through the frozen air like something sharp and careless. Inside, 16-year-old Evelyn Mercer heard the bolt slide home. She pressed her back against the barn wall and felt the cold seeping through the wood, through her thin dress, into her bones. She had survived hunger. She had survived beatings. But nobody had ever survived a night in Gideon Blackridge's barn. At least, that was what they said. If you were Evelyn tonight, 16 years old, alone, and locked in the dark, what would you do? If this story moves you, please subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Hit the like button and drop a comment with your city or country. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's find out what happened when the most feared man on the frontier opened his own barn door and found a girl who refused to disappear. The cold came in through the gaps between the boards, the way water finds every crack, patient, thorough, and utterly without mercy. Evelyn had been counting her breaths for the better part of an hour, not because she thought it would help, but because it gave her something to do besides listen to the wind work itself into a howl outside. The barn smelled of old hay and axle grease and something else beneath it, the particular stillness of a place that had been empty a long time. Whatever animals had once lived here, they were gone. The stalls were bare. The only living thing in Gideon Blackridge's barn was Evelyn Mercer, and she was doing her very best not to think about whether that was going to remain true until morning. She was not supposed to be here. That thought kept returning, not as complaint but as a kind of stupid, useless fact her mind kept offering up. She was not supposed to be here. She was supposed to be in her narrow bunk at Hartwell House, under the thin wool blanket that smelled of mildew and other people's old sorrow, listening to the pipes clank through the walls. Instead, she was on the dirt floor of a barn belonging to a man who, depending on which story you believed, had either shot 3 drifters for trespassing, or 5, or had once chased a deputy sheriff off his land with an axe handle, and the deputy had never spoken right again afterward. The chain around her left wrist was the part she hadn't expected. When Vivian and her girls had pushed her through the barn door, she'd stumbled forward into the dark and nearly gone down on her hands and knees. By the time she'd gotten her bearings, she'd heard the bolt, and then, a beat later, the particular sound of a padlock clicking shut. She'd gone back to the door and pushed it, pulled it, felt along the frame for any give, any weakness. There was none. Then one of the girls outside, Clara Prentice, she thought, from the particular nastiness of the giggle, had pushed something through the gap between the bottom of the door and the ground. It was a length of chain, iron, with a cuff at one end. A note was tied to it. She couldn't read the note in the dark, but Clara had been kind enough to read it aloud through the door. "Tradition says you wear the chain. It's so Gideon knows you're the one he gets to deal with, not us. We'll be back in the morning. Assuming." The assuming had been Vivian's contribution. She could tell by the particular way the word landed, unhurried and pleased with itself. Evelyn had not put the chain on. That had felt important. She was sitting with it in her lap instead, running her thumb along the links out of something that was not quite habit, more like the need to keep her hands doing something while her mind worked through the problem. The problem being simply that she did not know how to get out of this barn, she did not know what time Gideon Blackridge might return to it, and she did not know which version of him was true. She had been in Ash Hollow Crossing for 4 months. 4 months was long enough to understand the hierarchy of the place, the way power worked in a frontier town where the law was 2 days' ride away, and the people with money had been here long enough to believe the town existed for their convenience. Hartwell House sat in the middle of that system in a way that was hard to explain to someone who hadn't lived it. On paper, Martha Hartwell ran a respectable boarding house for young women of limited means, providing room and board in exchange for domestic service. In practice, the exchange was somewhat different. You worked. You did not complain about the work. You did not eat until the family ate. You did not sleep until the work was finished. And if the daughters of Ash Hollow Crossing's better families decided to amuse themselves at your expense, you learned quickly that Martha Hartwell would hear nothing about it, because Martha Hartwell's comfortable life depended on the goodwill of those families, and a girl with nowhere else to go had very little leverage in that arrangement. Evelyn had figured all of this out by the end of her first week. She had not figured out how to change it. That was the part that kept her awake most nights, the part that had been wearing at her steadily for 4 months. She was 16 years old. She had no family she could name, no money she could claim, no skill that anyone in Ash Hollow Crossing seemed to value, beyond the ability to scrub a floor until it shone. She had tried once to speak to the deputy about the way the Hartwell girls handled the boarders, and he had listened with an expression of careful patience before telling her that young girls sometimes had trouble adjusting to hard work, and that perhaps she ought to be grateful for a roof over her head. She had not tried again. Vivian Cross had noticed her on her third day. Evelyn had been carrying a basket of laundry across the yard when the girl appeared, 16 herself, maybe 17, with the particular ease of someone who had never once in her life wondered where her next meal was coming from. She was pretty in the way that money makes people pretty, well-fed and well-rested, and dressed in a coat that cost more than everything Evelyn owned, which was not a difficult benchmark to clear. She had looked at Evelyn the way you might look at a stray dog that had wandered into your garden. Curious, a little amused, entirely certain of the difference in their respective positions. "You're the new one," Vivian had said. It wasn't a question, so Evelyn hadn't answered it. That had been a mistake, she understood now. Not answering wasn't defiance, or at least she hadn't meant it as defiance. She'd just been tired and cold, and she had laundry to get inside before it froze. But Vivian Cross had taken it as defiance, and from that afternoon forward, Evelyn had been her project. It had started small: the spilled wash water, the missing food from her plate, the whisper campaign among the other girls that Evelyn was a thief, a liar, that she'd been turned out of her last position for stealing. None of it was true. It didn't need to be true to be effective. The other boarders kept their distance because getting close to Evelyn meant getting close to Vivian's attention, and nobody wanted that. Evelyn ate alone and slept alone and worked her hours in a silence that she told herself was self-preservation, but which sometimes, at the end of a long day, felt a great deal more like defeat. The barn thing, she'd heard about it from another girl, Marjorie, who had left Hartwell House for a job as a seamstress's assistant the week before Evelyn arrived. Marjorie had pressed a note into her hand on her way out, a single folded square of paper that said only, "When they talk about the barn, don't go. Whatever they say, don't go." Evelyn had kept the note. She had thought about it often. She had not, in the end, been given much choice about whether she went or not. Vivian and 4 others had come for her after supper on a Tuesday. She'd been washing the last of the dinner dishes when they'd walked into the kitchen, and she'd known immediately from the quality of their silence, charged, anticipatory, the silence of people who have already decided what's going to happen, that this was not a casual visit. She'd kept her hands in the water and her face neutral and said nothing. "You've been here 4 months," Vivian said. "That's a long time to go without your initiation." "I don't need any initiation." "Oh, everyone needs one," Vivian smiled. "It's tradition." The other girls fanned out behind her in a way that was practiced, almost casual. One of them, Ruth, who was 16 and had a mean little laugh she saved for when adults weren't watching, had gone to stand between Evelyn and the back door. Another positioned herself near the hallway. Evelyn had counted exits the way she counted everything, automatically and without thinking about it, and the calculation was not encouraging. "What happens if I say no?" she asked. Vivian tilted her head, as if this were a genuinely interesting question she was considering for the first time. "Well," she said, "then we tell Mrs. Hartwell we found some of her silver missing, and you know how she is about her silver." She paused. "We have a witness who'll say she saw you take it. 2 witnesses, actually." Evelyn looked at the girl nearest the back door. Ruth looked back at her with an expression of perfect blankness that confirmed everything Vivian had just said. This was the calculation she had been doing for 4 months, and every time she ran the numbers, they came out the same way. She had nothing. They had everything. And in a town like Ash Hollow Crossing, the nothing people lost. She pulled her hands out of the wash water and dried them on her apron. "Fine," she said. "Where's this barn?" She had not even then been particularly afraid of Gideon Blackridge. She'd been afraid of the cold, which was real and immediate, and promised to kill her in ways that didn't depend on legend or rumor. She'd been afraid of the dark, which she'd always found harder to endure than most things. But the man himself, some recluse on a failing ranch who scared people by virtue of keeping to himself, she couldn't quite make herself afraid of a story. Stories were what people with power told to keep people without it in their place. She'd been hearing stories her whole life, and she'd learned not to be impressed by them. What she hadn't accounted for was the chain. She sat with it in her lap now, and thought about Marjorie's note and thought about the 4 months behind her and tried, with the careful discipline she had developed over a lifetime of having nothing else, to think clearly about her options. She could try the door again. She had already tried the door. She could try to find another way out, but she'd walked the perimeter of the barn twice in the dark with her hands on the walls, and the boards were solid and the hinges were on the outside. She could wait for morning and Vivian's girls to return. That option had a particular flavor to it that she did not want to taste. Or she could wait for Gideon Blackridge, who might or might not be coming, who might or might not be a killer, who was the only unknown variable in the whole miserable equation. She chose the third option by default, mostly because it was the only one she had any remaining control over. She wasn't going to put the chain on. She was going to stay on her feet and keep her hands free and find out what kind of man actually lived in this barn before she decided how to be afraid of him. She was still working through the arithmetic of her situation when she heard the hoofbeats. They came up from the east, which surprised her. She'd expected anyone returning to this barn to come from the direction of town, from the road. These came across open ground, a single horse moving at a steady pace that said the rider knew the land and wasn't in any hurry. She heard the horse slow, heard it blow out a breath, heard it stop just outside the barn door. Then silence. Then the particular sound of a man getting down out of a saddle, unhurried, with the careful economy of someone whose body had done this 10,000 times. She stood up, put the chain on the ground, squared her shoulders and faced the door. The padlock, Vivian's padlock, on the outside, clicked open. Then a pause, just a breath, just a beat. Then the bolt. Then the door opened, and the wind came in first, and behind it came the lamp. He was bigger than she'd expected, and older. Not old, maybe 30, maybe a hard-worn 35, with a face that had been weathered down to something spare and angular, the kind of face that had stopped bothering to arrange itself for other people's comfort some years back. He was holding a lantern at shoulder height, which meant the light fell on her first, and on him second, and she saw his expression clearly across the 10 feet of barn between them. He had not expected to find a person. Whatever he'd expected, a stray animal, a trespasser, some piece of equipment left out in the wrong weather. It hadn't been a 16-year-old girl standing in the middle of his barn with a chain at her feet and her chin up, looking at him like she was the one deciding how this went. He stood in the doorway for a moment without saying anything. She watched him look at the chain, look at her, look at the door. She could see him assembling the picture the way a careful man puts things together before he speaks, and she decided in those seconds that whatever else was true about Gideon Blackridge, he wasn't stupid. "Who chained you in here?" he said. It wasn't a question. "I didn't say I was chained." "The chain's on the floor. Door was padlocked from the outside." He looked at her steadily. "Who did it?" She met his eyes. They were gray, the kind of gray that was hard to read in lamplight, and they were doing the same thing hers were, taking inventory, measuring, deciding what was true. She recognized that look. She'd spent her life doing it. "Some girls from town," she said, "Vivian Cross and her friends. They called it a tradition." Something moved across his face, not surprise exactly, but a kind of confirmation, the way a man looks when something he suspected turns out to be exactly as bad as he'd feared. He looked down at the chain again, then back at her. "You're from Hartwell House." 4 months. "How old are you?" 16. He lowered the lantern, reached into his coat pocket and came out with a small tool. A bolt cutter, compact, the kind you carry when you work a ranch and things break unexpectedly. He held it out toward the chain, then stopped. "That's not on you," he said. "No, I didn't put it on." He looked at her for one more moment with that gray, reading look. Then he crossed the barn, picked up the chain, and cut it in two with a single clean motion. He tossed both halves into the corner. Then he straightened up, and for the first time since he'd come through the door, something in his posture changed. Not softer exactly, but deliberate. Like a man who has made a decision and is now occupying it fully. "You should come inside," he said. "You'll freeze out here." She studied him. She was very good at reading people, had learned it young and sharpened it in 4 months at Hartwell House, and what she was reading now was complicated. He was guarded in the way that people get guarded when the world has given them substantial reasons to be. There was something beneath that guardedness that she couldn't name yet, something worn and careful and possibly, she wasn't sure, possibly decent. She had been wrong about people before. She had also been right about them. She couldn't afford to be wrong tonight. She looked at the barn door. She looked at him. "All right," she said. She walked past him through the barn door and the cold hit her like a wall, and she kept her face steady against it because she had practiced keeping her face steady against things that hurt. He came out behind her and pulled the door shut, and she heard him replace his own padlock on the outside. Not Vivian's, but a different one, a heavier one. She noticed that. She noticed everything. The house was 100 yards across open ground. The wind came across it sideways and without apology, and by the time they reached the door, her hands had gone past cold into something that felt like burning. He opened the door and held it, and she went through it into warmth that hit her like something physical, a force, a presence. She stopped just inside and stood there for a moment with her eyes closed and just breathed it in. She heard him come in behind her, heard him hang up his coat, heard the particular sounds of a man moving through his own kitchen with familiar hands, the scratch of a match, the creak of a stove door being opened. She opened her eyes. The kitchen was clean. That was the first thing she noticed. Not neat in the way of a household being maintained for appearances, but clean in the way of a space that someone actually used and actually cared for, quietly and without fuss. There was a shelf of books along one wall, which she hadn't expected. There was a tin cup still on the table from that morning, which she had. He set a pot on the stove without asking whether she wanted anything. She sat down at the table because her legs were asking her to, and she folded her hands in front of her and waited. "Tell me," he said without turning around, "what she said to you to get you in there." So she told him. All of it. Not the whole 4 months, not yet, but enough. The threatened accusation of theft. The witnesses. The way the exit had been blocked before the choice was offered. She told it plainly, the way she told herself everything, without decoration, because she had never had the luxury of making things sound different from what they were. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he poured 2 cups of something hot. Not coffee, too pale for that, some kind of tea, and set one in front of her and took the other to the chair across the table and sat down with it. "How long has this been going on?" he said. "The rest of it, not just tonight." She looked at her cup. 4 months. And before Hartwell House, she picked up the cup and held it with both hands and let the warmth move up through her palms and into her wrists before she answered. "A long time," she said, "since I was about 9. He didn't say he was sorry. She was glad of that. She was tired of people who said they were sorry about things they didn't intend to change. He just looked at her with those gray, careful eyes and nodded once, slowly, as if something had been confirmed for him. Outside, the wind pushed at the walls. The stove ticked. Somewhere off in the dark, his horse was in a proper barn, warm and fed. Evelyn drank her tea and thought about Marjorie's note, and about Vivian's smile at the barn door, and about the sound a padlock makes when it closes. And she thought, not for the first time, but with a new kind of clarity, that she was done. Done being someone's tradition. Done fitting into the space other people decided she was permitted to occupy. She didn't know yet what came next, or how she was going to get there. She was 16 years old, and she had nothing. She knew that. But she was also sitting at Gideon Blackridge's table, alive, in from the cold, with her hands wrapped around a cup of hot tea she hadn't had to earn, and for the first time in 4 months, nobody in this room wanted anything from her except, possibly, the truth. That was a start. It wasn't much, but she had always known how to start with not much. She set down the cup and met his eyes. "You knew about the tradition," she said. "Not an accusation, an observation." "Didn't you?" He looked at her steadily. "I'd heard it, and you never stopped it." The silence that followed that was not comfortable. He didn't make it comfortable, didn't reach for an excuse or a justification. He sat with it the way a man sits with something that doesn't excuse itself, and finally said, "No, I didn't." She nodded. She could work with honest, even when honest wasn't good. "Then I need you to understand," she said, "that whatever comes next, I'm not going back there." He didn't answer right away. That was the thing about Gideon Blackridge that Evelyn would come to understand over the following days. He didn't answer things right away. He sat with questions the way some men sat with whiskey, letting them settle before he decided what to do with them. It wasn't evasion. It was the habit of a man who had learned, at some cost, that words said too quickly had a way of costing more than silence. He looked at her across the table. The stove popped. The wind kept working at the walls. No, he said finally. You're not. Those two words landed differently than she'd expected. Not a promise, exactly. She'd heard enough promises to be careful about them, but something more structural than that. A fact being stated. She filed it away and finished her tea and didn't ask him what he meant to do about it, because she could see he was still working that out himself, and she had enough experience reading people to know that pressing a man while he was thinking was how you got a worse answer than the one he'd been working toward. He showed her the spare room without ceremony. It was small and cold and smelled of cedar and disuse, but there was a quilt on the bed that was thick and clean, and the window had its glass intact, which was more than she could say for the room she'd slept in at Hartwell House. She sat on the edge of the bed and listened to him move through the house, banking the stove, checking the door latch, the ordinary sounds of a man shutting down for the night, and thought about what morning was going to bring. Morning was going to bring Vivian Cross. She lay down with her boots still on and her eyes on the ceiling and let herself think it through the way she thought through everything, clearly and without the mercy of pretending it was better than it was. Vivian would come back to the barn at dawn or shortly after. She would find the padlock cut and Evelyn gone. She would assume, correctly, that Gideon had returned and let her out. What she would do next depended on how much she feared him and how much she wanted to make an example of Evelyn. And Evelyn had spent 4 months learning that Vivian Cross's need to win consistently outweighed her better judgment. She heard Gideon's door close down the hall. She stared at the ceiling for a while longer, and then, because she was 16 and exhausted and had been running on nothing but cold and nerve for hours, she fell asleep. She woke to the sound of horses. Not one horse, several. She was upright before she was fully awake, that old alarm in her chest firing without waiting for her mind to catch up, and she was at the window in 3 steps. The gray of early morning had just started to separate itself from the dark. 3 riders coming up the road. She recognized the horse in front before she could make out the face. A dun mare with a white sock on the left foreleg that she'd seen tied outside Hartwell House 100 times. Martha Hartwell herself. With 2 men Evelyn didn't know flanking her. She crossed the hallway in 4 steps and knocked on Gideon's door. 2 sharp raps. A beat of silence. "I heard," he said, from inside. She went to the kitchen and stood where she could see the front door. She heard him dress, the particular efficiency of a man who could do it in the dark, and he came out pulling his suspenders up over his shoulders, his face carrying the flat, settled expression of someone who was not surprised. He looked at her standing in the kitchen, and then at the window, and then back at her. "Stay in here," he said. "I'd rather stay in here." He reached past her for his coat. "Not because I think you need protecting, because I want them to have to ask where you are." She thought about that for a moment. It was a tactical decision, she realized. Make Martha Hartwell state aloud what she'd come for before anyone could see whether she had it. Make the claim explicit before it got satisfied. She moved to the side of the kitchen window where she could hear clearly and not be seen from outside. He opened the front door before they'd finished tying the horses. Martha Hartwell was a woman in her late 40s who had the kind of authority that came from 30 years of nobody in a small town questioning her directly. She was broad-shouldered and practical in her dress, and she wore that authority the way she wore her coat, as a matter of course without thinking about it, because she couldn't imagine a situation where it wouldn't be sufficient. She looked at Gideon the way she looked at everything, as an inconvenience to be managed. "Mr. Blackridge," she said, her voice carried even at a distance, "I believe you have something that belongs to me." Evelyn, from the kitchen, felt her jaw tighten at the phrasing, something, not someone. Gideon stood in his doorway with his arms loose at his sides and said nothing, which Evelyn was already learning was its own kind of answer. Martha waited. When he still didn't speak, a faint line appeared between her brows. "The girl, Evelyn Mercer, she's bound to Hartwell House for service. She left without authorization." "She didn't leave," Gideon said. "She was put in my barn." A pause. "I'm not aware of any such by Vivian Cross," he said, "and 4 other girls. With a chain." He let that sit for exactly 1 beat. "My barn, my chain, my property they trespassed on." Martha's posture shifted. Not much, just the slightest recalibration, the way a person shifts when an argument they expected to be simple turns out to have corners. "Children's mischief," she said. "It has nothing to do with the girl's obligations to my establishment." "Her obligations to your establishment," Gideon said, Included being locked in a barn in January with no coat. That's an exaggeration. Is it? He looked at the two men with her for the first time. They were hired hands of some kind, not deputies, nothing official, which told Evelyn something. If Martha had had legal standing here, she'd have brought legal standing. You want to tell me whose padlock I cut off my own door? Martha looked at him with the expression of a woman trying to decide how much this particular battle was worth. Mr. Blackridge, I don't want any trouble. You rode out here before sunrise, he said. What did you think that was going to be? Another recalibration. She tried a different angle. The girl is 16, unattached. She has no family, no means. My house is the appropriate place for her until I'll take her. The words fell into the morning air and lay there. Martha stared at him. The two men with her exchanged a glance. From the kitchen, Evelyn went very still. I beg your pardon, Martha said. I'll take responsibility for her. Gideon's voice hadn't changed. Same flat, steady register he'd been using since he opened the door. If the issue is that she needs a household and a lawful arrangement, she can have one here, as my wife. The silence that followed was the kind that has actual weight to it. Evelyn was aware of her own heartbeat in a way she wasn't usually. She pressed her back against the kitchen wall and stared at the ceiling and tried to think, very quickly and very clearly, about what he had just done and why. She was still thinking when Martha Hartwell said, with the particular clipped precision of a woman who is furious and choosing not to show it, that is a highly irregular proposal. It's a legal one, Gideon said. She's 16. In this territory, with consent and a magistrate, it's perfectly lawful, considerably more lawful than keeping a minor in involuntary service. You cannot possibly, Mrs. Hartwell. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Go home. Send me a bill for whatever you believe she owes you, and I'll settle it. But you're not taking her back. Martha looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at the house. Evelyn had the distinct feeling she was being looked at through the kitchen wall, and she held herself very still, as if stillness might help. She'll need to agree, Martha said, or it means nothing. Yes, Gideon said. She will. He came back inside and closed the door and stood in the hallway and looked at the kitchen, where Evelyn had come to stand in the doorway because she was done letting herself be discussed from a distance. He looked at her the way he had in the barn, that gray measuring look, and she looked back at him. You heard, he said, all of it. I should have asked you first. She considered whether that was true. If he'd asked her first, inside, she would have had to decide while Martha Hartwell sat on her horse 20 feet away. And the deciding with someone waiting for the answer was a different thing from the deciding free of that pressure. He'd made the offer first and left the choice genuinely hers, which was either a mistake or, she thought about the tactical logic of keeping her in the kitchen, not a mistake at all. What does it mean for you? She said. Actually, a legal arrangement you'd have standing in this county, your own name on the ranch documents, if we do it right. She can't come after you. Cross can't come after you. Nobody can claim you owe them anything. And what do you get? He was quiet for a moment. Help, he said. The ranch is behind on everything. I'm not a good bookkeeper. I'm not much of a farmer. I know cattle and I know land and I don't know much else, and that's been catching up with me. She nodded slowly. It was honest. It was the kind of honest she'd decided she could work with last night across a cup of tea. It wasn't a romance, and it wasn't a rescue. It was an exchange between two people who had something the other needed. She understood exchanges. She'd been making them her whole life, most of them in favor of the other party. All right, she said. He blinked. Just once. The slight involuntary surprise of a man who had not been certain of the answer. All right. But I want it in writing. Whatever the arrangement is, I want to be able to read it, and I want a copy. Yes, he said. That's reasonable. And I want to know what the ranch actually owes and to who. All of it. I'm not walking into something blind. I can do that. She looked at him for one more moment. Outside, she heard Martha Hartwell's horses moving away down the road, and the sound of it was the particular sound of one door closing while something else, she didn't know what yet, remained very much open. Then we should probably figure out where to find a magistrate, she said. They found one in Burnt Creek, 17 miles east, a man named Hadley, who had been officiating legal arrangements in 3 counties for 22 years, and who looked at Gideon and Evelyn across his desk with the practiced neutrality of a man who had seen stranger things and intended to keep his opinions to himself. He asked the required questions. He got the required answers. He wrote down the required information in his ledger with a pen that scratched loudly in the quiet office. And when he was done, he looked up and said, "You understand this is a legal contract, both of you?" "Yes," Evelyn said. "Yes," Gideon said. "All right then." He stamped the document and signed it and dated it and handed the copy across the desk to Evelyn, not to Gideon. She noticed that. She thought Hadley was perhaps not as neutral as he was performing, and she liked him a little for it. She folded the document and put it inside her dress, against her skin, because that was where she put things she needed to keep. The ride back to the ranch took most of an afternoon. They didn't talk much. There was, Evelyn was finding, a particular quality to Gideon's silences. They didn't demand filling. He rode with the ease of a man who had spent most of his life on horseback and thought better there than anywhere else. And she rode beside him on a brown mare named Frances who had opinions about the pace and expressed them with moderate frequency. The cold had let up enough to be merely unpleasant rather than dangerous, and the land around them was flat and spare and went on for what seemed like forever. And she looked at it and tried to imagine what it would be like to know a piece of it was yours. She couldn't quite do it yet, but she was working on it. The first thing she asked him for back at the ranch was the books. He brought them out with the particular reluctance of a man surrendering something embarrassing: 2 ledgers, a folder of receipts, and a loose collection of notes in handwriting that appeared to have been made in a moving wagon during an earthquake. She sat at the kitchen table with all of it and a lamp and went through it methodically, the way she'd taught herself to go through things, starting from the beginning and not skipping ahead to the part she was afraid of. It took her most of the evening. When she was done, she sat for a while with her hands flat on the table and looked at the wall. Then she said, to no one in particular, "How long have you been running this short?" 3 years, Gideon said from the doorway. He'd been there for a while, she thought, watching her work. "Since my brother left." She looked at him. "You had a partner." "I had a brother. It's not always the same thing." He came and sat down across from her and looked at the open ledger between them with the expression of a man looking at something he's been avoiding. "He took his share of the cattle when he went. Left me the land and the debt." "He had a share of the debt?" "He had the larger share." A pause. "He didn't take that with him." Evelyn looked at the numbers. She looked at the land outside the window, though she couldn't see it in the dark. Then she started making a list, which was what she did when the size of a problem threatened to become larger than her ability to think about it. She made it into pieces, and the pieces she could manage. "The south pasture," she said. "It's not being used. Too dry. Not for grazing, for kitchen gardens. Multiple of them. And if the growing season's long enough, for preserving." She looked up. "There's a market for preserved goods in the mining camps. Tinned food's expensive and unreliable. If we could supply 3 or 4 camps with consistent product, we don't have the equipment for preserving on that scale." "Not yet." She looked back at the list. "What do you have that's working?" He told her. It took a while, and it was not an easy conversation for him. She could see that, see him choosing each word with the care of a man who was accustomed to carrying the weight of his failures privately and was not practiced at laying them out for another person. She didn't make it easier or harder. She just listened and wrote things down. And when he was done, she had 2 columns, one of debts and one of assets. And the assets column was shorter, but it existed, and that was what mattered. "This land?" she said. "The deed. It's clear? No lien?" "No lien." "You're sure?" Something crossed his face that she couldn't read. "I'm sure. I've checked it more than once." She filed that reaction away, the slight edge in the words, the thing beneath them, and made a note to come back to it. "Not tonight." "Then we have something to work from," she said. "It's not comfortable, but it's not nothing." He looked at her across the table with an expression that was difficult to describe. Not gratitude, exactly. She'd seen enough false gratitude to know what that looked like, and this was different. It was more like recognition, like a man seeing something he'd given up expecting to find. "You learned all this where?" he said. "Nowhere." She closed the ledger. "I just paid attention to things that other people didn't think were worth paying attention to." He nodded. She thought he understood that better than most would. Ash Hollow Crossing found out about the marriage in the way that small frontier towns found out about everything. through a chain of whispered information that moved faster than horses and was considerably less accurate. By the time the news reached the Cross family, it had accumulated several additional details that were entirely fictional, but the core of it was true enough to produce the response it produced, which was immediate and loud and expressed itself first, through Martha Hartwell arriving at Vivian Cross's house, and then through Harold Cross appearing in the middle of town and saying, within earshot of no fewer than 8 people, that Gideon Blackridge had lost whatever mind he'd once possessed. Evelyn heard about this third hand from a woman named Dora, who ran the dry goods store and who had a complicated relationship with the Cross family that led her to relay the news to Evelyn with the neutrality she was clearly working to maintain. Dora was perhaps 50, sharp-eyed and practical, and she looked at Evelyn across the counter of her store with an expression that mixed assessment with something that might, eventually, become respect. "Harold Cross said you had the look of a schemer," Dora told her, placing a sack of flour on the counter. "For what it's worth." "What did you say?" Evelyn asked. "I said you had the look of someone who'd been cold long enough to make a sensible decision." Dora looked at her steadily. "Which is not the same thing, but it's closer to accurate." Evelyn paid for the flour and the salt and the 2 jars she needed and put them in the wagon with the deliberate calm of someone practicing, not reacting to things that were designed to make her react. She drove back to the ranch and unloaded the supplies and made supper with the particular focus she brought to everything, which was the focus of someone who had decided that doing things well was the only power she'd reliably had access to. Gideon came in from the pasture while she was cooking. He smelled of cold air and cattle and work, and he washed his hands at the basin and sat down and said nothing about his day, in the way of a man who doesn't lead with his problems. She put a plate in front of him and sat down with her own, and they ate in the silence that was becoming familiar, the kind of silence that wasn't uncomfortable. "Harold Cross came by the east fence today," he said eventually. She put down her fork. "And?" "Didn't say much. Just looked?" Gideon's jaw worked briefly. "He's been wanting this land for 7 years. Eastfield runs along his water access." "You knew him before this?" "I knew him before the reputation made people pretend they didn't know me." There was something flat and old in his voice. "He's been trying to buy this parcel since my brother and I were still working it together. My brother wanted to sell. I didn't." She thought about the ledger, about the way his expression had shifted when she asked about the deed. "Is that why your brother left?" The silence lasted long enough to have an answer inside it. "Partly," he said. "Harold offered him money, more money than the place was worth at the time." He picked up his fork, put it down again. "My brother thought I was being stubborn. Maybe I was. But I knew if Harold Cross got the Eastfield, he'd have the water, and without the water, the rest of the land was worth nothing in a dry year. He'd have just waited for a dry year and taken the rest for nothing." "So you kept the land and lost the partner, and the cattle, and any help?" He looked at his plate. "Yeah." She was quiet for a moment, processing the shape of it, the strategy Harold had already attempted, the patience of it, the way he'd worked the edges before going for the center. She'd seen smaller versions of this her entire life, the way people with power moved against people without it, never directly, if indirectly, was available. "He's going to try again," she said. "I know. Now that there are 2 of us, he might try harder." Gideon looked at her. "Or he might think I'm weaker because I've got a 16-year-old girl to manage." "That would be a mistake," she said, and returned to her supper. Vivian Cross appeared in town 2 days later looking at Evelyn the way she'd always looked at her, except now with the added intensity of someone who had miscalculated and needed to find the error in someone else's arithmetic rather than her own. She was standing outside the mercantile with Clara Prentice and another girl when Evelyn came by with the wagon, and for a moment neither of them said anything, and the moment stretched. "Well," Vivian said, "Mrs. Blackridge." She said the name the way you'd say a bad joke. Evelyn looked at her with an expression she had spent years perfecting. Attentive, not submissive, not hostile, simply clear-eyed and present. She had nothing to prove to Vivian Cross, and no performance to give her. "Vivian," she said, and went into the mercantile. Vivian followed her in. Evelyn had expected that. She moved to the counter and waited for Thomas Reel, the owner, to finish with his current customer, and she was aware of Vivian behind her without turning to acknowledge it. "You know this won't last," Vivian said, quietly enough that only Evelyn would hear. "He'll get tired of you. Everybody does." Evelyn turned. She looked at Vivian with the same clear expression, the same absence of either deference or antagonism. She thought about the chain on the barn floor. She thought about the night she'd spent counting her breaths against the cold. She thought about the document folded against her skin and Gideon's voice in the early morning saying, simply, she's not going back. "Did you want something specific?" Evelyn said. "Or did you come in here just to make sure I knew you were watching?" Vivian's expression flickered. Just for a moment, a crack in the surface through which something less certain moved. "I'm watching," she said. "I know." Evelyn turned back to the counter. "So am I." Thomas' reel appeared and she placed her order and paid with the careful accounting of someone who knew exactly what she had and what she needed and was not going to get either of them confused. She could feel Vivian behind her until she finished, and then she heard her leave, and the bell above the door rang. And Thomas looked at Evelyn with the careful neutrality of a man who did business with everyone and tried to have opinions about nobody. "She comes in here most days," he offered. "I imagine she does," Evelyn said, and counted her change. The work of those early weeks had a texture to it that she hadn't expected. She'd worked hard her whole life. She knew what hard work felt like. The particular quality of exhaustion that came from labor done for someone else. The way it settled into your bones differently than labor done for yourself. This was different. Every hour she put into the South Pasture plan, every column she balanced in the ledger, every conversation she had with Dora about what the mining camps were buying and at what price. It accumulated differently. It felt like building rather than servicing, and the difference was not small. Gideon worked alongside her without offering instruction she hadn't asked for, which she appreciated more than she could have explained. He showed her how the land lay, where the water table ran, which parts of the east field got morning sun and which got afternoon. She showed him how to structure an account in a way you could actually read it. They talked about the ranch the way you talk about a problem you're both invested in solving, practically and without ceremony. And somewhere in the third week she realized that she no longer sat at the kitchen table with the sense of waiting for the floor to give way. She wrote letters to the mining camps herself. In the careful, plain hand she'd taught herself from an almanac when she was 11. She listed what they could supply, the quantities, the schedule, the price. She sent 3 letters out and got 2 replies, and one of the replies was an order. She showed it to Gideon at supper. He read it twice. Then he put it on the table and looked at her with that expression. The recognition one, the one she was starting to know. "That's real," he said. "Yes." "How did you know they'd want it?" "I didn't," she said. "I knew they needed food and hated paying for shipped tins. The only way to find out if they'd buy from us was to ask." She picked up the letter. "Most people don't ask. They assume the answer is no and don't bother." He thought about that. "Is that what happened to you? People assumed." She folded the letter and put it in the account folder. "People assumed I'd accept whatever I was given," she said. "I was trying to correct that misunderstanding." He didn't smile exactly. His face didn't do that easily. But something in it shifted the way it sometimes did, a slight softening around the eyes that she had come to recognize as the equivalent. "I think," he said, "you're doing all right at that." It was, in its way, a large thing to say. She received it as such, without making a production of it, and went back to her supper. The town, meanwhile, was making up its mind about them at the particular glacial pace of places that have decided they know everything and are resistant to evidence to the contrary. Some people came around faster than others. Dora had made her decision within the first week and expressed it through the reliable mechanism of fair prices and good information. The blacksmith, a man named Pell, who had no particular love for the Cross family and a long memory for slights, showed up at the ranch one afternoon to fix a piece of equipment he'd heard they needed, charged half what he'd normally charge, and left without explanation. Evelyn noted every one of these, quietly, in a way that wasn't quite accounting but was close to it, a running record of who had decided what, and why, and what it might mean. What it meant was that the town was not as uniformly against them as Harold Cross's position would have suggested. Harold had influence and money and 30 years of established presence, but he had also, somewhere along the way, spent enough of those advantages making enemies that the goodwill wasn't as deep as the surface suggested. Evelyn could feel the shape of it, the way she'd learned to feel the shape of social systems from the outside, where the weight was, where the cracks were, what the load-bearing parts actually were versus what merely appeared to support things. She had spent her whole life being on the outside of systems like this. She was beginning to understand that the outside view had its uses. Gideon was harder to read than the town, and she made less quick progress with him, which was perhaps appropriate given that whatever they were building between them was slower and more deliberate than a supply arrangement with a mining camp. He was not cold. She'd known cold, and he wasn't it. But he was defended in the way of someone who had given trust before and had the specific wounds that came from giving it to the wrong people. His brother. Harold Cross's early attempts. The town's comfortable adoption of his frightening reputation, which had suited some people enormously because a man everyone was afraid of could be used as a threat without any of them having to take responsibility for using him. She understood that particular dynamic perhaps better than she understood anything else, because it was what had been done to her, in miniature, for years, the story told about her that served other people's purposes, with no concern for what it cost the person the story was about. She told him that one evening, not as a confession, but as an observation, when they were sitting on the porch in the dark after supper with the cold having settled into something drier and less brutal than it had been. Vivian and Martha and all of them, she said, they needed the story about you, the violent recluse, the dangerous man on the edge of town. She looked at the dark pasture. Made it easier to use your barn as a punishment without having to own the punishment themselves. If something happened to a girl in there, they could say it was your fault. He was quiet for a moment. Nothing ever did happen. Because you were never actually there. She looked at him. How many times did you find signs that someone had been in the barn? A long pause. A few. And you never did anything about it. The silence this time had the same quality as the one earlier about his brother. The answer inside it, waiting. No, he said. Why? He turned his cup in his hands, a slow rotation, because dealing with it meant going into town, talking to people who'd already decided what I was. He stopped. It felt like proving them right, going in looking angry about something. She understood that too, in a different but parallel way, the way that the story told about you could become a trap, where any action you took to refute it looked from the outside like confirmation. She'd been in that trap herself. You fight back, you're difficult. You comply, you're easy to use. The trap had no good exit from the inside. We're going to have to go into town, she said, together, regularly, as if we belong there. He looked at her. We do belong there. I know that, she said. The point is showing it. She looked back at the pasture. People who think you're strange and dangerous need to see you buying nails and talking about the weather. It's harder to maintain a monster story about someone who keeps showing up and being ordinary. That's a considerable amount of nail buying, he said. Yes, she said. It is. He was quiet for another moment. Then, slowly, he said, You've thought about this kind of thing for a long time. Since I was about 9, she said, which is when I figured out that I was going to have to think about it, or I wasn't going to make it. He didn't say anything to that, but he looked at her in the dark with that gray, careful regard, and she had the sense, the first clear sense up to that point, that he was seeing her. Not the arrangement, not the exchange, not the useful girl with the good accounting and the sharp mind for systems. Her. The person who had done the calculations and kept going anyway. She looked back at him and let herself be seen, which was not a thing she did easily. The porch was cold. The dark was deep and went on a long way in every direction. Inside the house, the stove had banked down to a low warmth, and the south pasture sat waiting for spring, and the account folder with the mining camp letter was on the kitchen table. Harold Cross came to the east fence again today, Gideon said. I know, she said. Dora told me. He's going to do something. I've known him long enough to know when he's done deciding. Yes, she said. So we need to be ready before he does. She looked at the dark land around them. Their land, both their names on the deed, the document folded against her skin, until she'd been able to put it somewhere safer. And she let herself feel, just briefly, what it would mean to lose it. Let herself feel the full weight of that, the way she let herself feel the full weight of everything hard. Because she had learned that pretending a thing wasn't heavy didn't make it lighter, only made you unprepared for how much it cost to carry. Then she set the feeling aside and started thinking. That was what she did. That was what she had always done. And now, for the first time in her life, she was doing it with someone beside her who was willing to do it too. Spring came to the Blackridge Ranch the way most good things came to that part of the territory. reluctantly, in pieces, with no guarantee it would stay. The south pasture thawed unevenly, the ground going soft in patches before hardening again overnight, and Evelyn learned to read the soil the way she read ledger columns, looking for the pattern beneath the surface variation, the underlying logic that the individual entries obscured. Gideon showed her how to turn the first rows with a hand plow, and she did it badly, and then less badly, and then with a kind of grim competence that he didn't praise but noticed, she could tell, in the way he stopped offering corrections. The seeds went in during the second week of April. Beans, primarily, because beans dried well, and the camps wanted protein they could cook fast and carry easy, some squash for variety. A kitchen garden closer to the house for their own use, which she planted herself one Saturday morning while Gideon was fixing fence line on the east boundary, kneeling in the dirt with her sleeves rolled up and her hands going dark with soil, and feeling, peculiarly, unexpectedly, something close to contentment. She didn't examine it too closely. Contentment was the kind of thing that got taken away when you looked at it directly. The first real trouble came on a Wednesday. She'd been in town at Dora's store going over the pricing on tin supplies when she came back to find Gideon standing in the middle of the south pasture with his jaw set and his hands at his sides in the particular stillness that she had come to understand meant he was working very hard not to do something he'd regret. 3 rows of bean seedlings, the ones nearest the east fence line, the ones that had come up strongest, had been walked through, methodically, systematically. Not a stray animal, not a careless horse. The pattern was too deliberate for that. Boot prints led from the east fence, crossed through the 3 rows, and went back the same way they came. She stood beside him and looked at it. "How many plants?" she said. 200. Maybe more. She bent down and checked one of the damaged seedlings, pressing the broken stem between her fingers. Recent. Done while she was in town, which meant while Gideon was also away from the direct sight line of this section. The timing was not accidental. "Did you see anyone on the east fence today?" "No." He paused. "I was on the west section this morning. I came around at noon." She stood up and looked at the fence line. The wire was intact. They hadn't cut through it. They'd gone over or under. And there was a place about 40 yards north where the post leaned at an angle that wasn't quite right, where the soil around the base had been disturbed. "They pushed the post," she said, "came under the wire." Gideon walked to the post and crouched and looked at the ground around it, then looked back at her. "Yeah," he said, 3 or 4 men from the prints." She put her hands in her apron pockets. She looked at the damaged rows and at the intact ones beside them, and at the fence line that separated their land from Harold Cross's grazing territory on the other side. She thought about the timing, the fact that she had mentioned the South Pasture plan to Dora 2 weeks ago in the ordinary course of discussing supply needs, and Dora, for all her goodwill, ran a store in the middle of a small town. Information traveled. "He was testing us," she said. Gideon stood. "Testing what?" "What we'd do." She turned to face him. "Whether we'd report it, ignore it, or come after him directly. He's trying to figure out what kind of people we are." "He already knows what kind of people I am." "He knows what kind of person you were," she said. "Alone. Reactive. He doesn't know what we are yet." She looked back at the damaged rows. "We're going to replant those seedlings. And we're going to write down what happened. Date, time, description of the damage, approximate number of boot prints, location of the disturbed fence post, in the account book. With the date." Gideon was quiet for a moment. "Evelyn, they killed 200 plants. I know that. Writing it down doesn't fix anything." "Not today," she said. "But if this is the beginning, and I think it is, then we're going to need a record of everything, every single thing. Because the day we go to someone with authority and say Harold Cross is destroying our property, we need more than our word against his." She met his eyes. "We need dates, descriptions, patterns. We need it to look like what it is, which is a campaign, not a coincidence." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he exhaled. "All right," he said. "And then we replant," she said. "Tomorrow morning, first thing." They replanted on Thursday. By Friday, the west fence had a section of wire cut clean, which was different from the testing of Wednesday. Less subtle, more direct, the kind of escalation that comes when the first action produces no visible panic. Gideon found it at dawn and came back to the house with the cut wire in his hand, and his face carrying an expression she hadn't seen on him before, something dark and tired that was older than anger. She wrote it in the account book. Date, location, description, length of wire cut, and estimated cost to replace. The wire was expensive. She noted the cost carefully because the accumulated cost was part of the record, and the record was the thing she was building. What she didn't write down, because it wasn't the kind of thing you put in an account book, was the quality of the silence at the supper table that Friday evening. Gideon ate without speaking, and she let him, because she understood that the silence was doing something, processing, containing, deciding, and that interrupting it was more likely to make things worse than better. But after supper, when she was clearing the plates, he said, "I know where his men drink." She set the plates in the basin. "I know you do," she said. You could, she said. And then Harold Cross would have exactly what he needs. A provocation he can describe to any authority figure in the territory. A reason to say you're violent and unstable and a danger to neighboring property. She turned around and leaned against the counter and looked at him. "He's been building that story about you for 7 years. Don't hand it to him." His jaw was tight. "So we just write it down." "We write it down," she said, "and we keep going, and we get bigger than he expects before he realizes what we're doing." He pushed back from the table and went to the window and stood there looking out at the dark, and she could see the fight in him. The part that wanted to solve this the way problems on the frontier had always been solved, directly and physically, and right now. She understood the appeal. She'd spent years wishing she could solve things that way herself. "It's harder," she said quietly. "What I'm asking you to do is harder than going to where his men drink. I know that." He didn't turn around. "You're 16 years old," he said. It wasn't dismissive, it was more like wonder, and a little like reproach directed at himself. "I've been doing this kind of arithmetic since I was 9, she said. "I told you." He was quiet for another moment. Then, "You really think writing it down is going to matter?" "I think building something real is going to matter," she said. "The writing is just so nobody can pretend it didn't happen." He turned from the window. His face had settled back into something she recognized. Still difficult, but directed. Problem-shaped rather than anger-shaped. "What's the next step?" he said. "The bigger thing." She'd been thinking about it since Wednesday. "Millhaven," she said. "It's 40 miles northwest. Mining camp, 200 men, no reliable food supply. I've been reading about it in the territorial notices. If we can get a contract with their camp manager before Harold Cross hears we're reaching past the eastern camps, he'll hear. Eventually, but if we're already in, it matters less." She came back to the table and sat down. "I also want to talk to 3 other ranching families in the county. Not about Harold directly, about a purchasing cooperative for seeds and tin supplies. If we're buying together, the price per unit goes down, and we're harder to squeeze individually." She looked at him. "I need introductions from you. They know your name." "They're afraid of my name." "That's different," she said. "Afraid means they remember it, and right now we need to be remembered." He sat down, looked at her across the table. "You've been planning this for a while." "Since the first fence post," she said, "possibly before." Something shifted in his expression again. The recognition look. The one she'd seen a handful of times now, the one that made her feel seen in a way that was still unfamiliar enough to be slightly uncomfortable. "All right," he said. "I'll take you to see the Halverson family on Saturday. Nils Halverson has 40 acres east of here. His wife Berta runs the actual operation. Talk to her." "What's her concern with Harold?" "Water rights. Same as mine. Different field, same problem." He paused. "She doesn't trust easily." "Neither do I," Evelyn said. "We'll get along." Berta Halverson was perhaps 55, with hands that looked like they'd been cured along with the hides she worked, and she listened to Evelyn's proposal for a purchasing cooperative with the expression of a woman who had heard many proposals over the years and had a reliable internal scale for which ones were real. She asked 4 questions. Hard ones, the kind that went to cost and logistics, and what happened when someone in the arrangement didn't pull their weight. And Evelyn answered all 4 without hedging, including the last one, which she answered by saying they'd need a written agreement that specified it. Berta looked at her. "You write things down," she said. "Everything," Evelyn said. Berta looked at Gideon, who was sitting across the table with the deliberate quietness of a man who had decided that the best thing he could do in this conversation was stay out of it. Then she looked back at Evelyn. "The Dietrich family, south of Burnt Creek," she said. "Talk to them next." Their seed costs are killing them. If you can show them numbers. She glanced at the paper Evelyn had brought, the one with the rough projected savings. Real numbers, like those, they'll listen. Can I use your name? Evelyn asked. Berta considered. Yes, she said. You can use my name. She used Berta's name with the Dietrichs, and the Dietrichs' name with a family called the Okafor Millers, who ranched on the other side of Burnt Creek, and within 6 weeks there were 4 families in the cooperative, and the combined purchasing order was enough to get a different price from the supply house in the county seat. The savings were not dramatic, but they were real, and real was the only kind that mattered to people who were already stretched thin. Meanwhile, the damage continued at the Blackridge Ranch. A section of roof on the equipment shed was loosened, not obviously, not catastrophically, but in a way that became a significant problem when the June rain came through. 3 of their cattle were found near the south fence 2 mornings in a row, restless and off feed, and when Gideon checked the water trough on that end, he found traces of something in it that turned his expression to iron and sent him straight to the account book without being asked. He was learning, she noted. The instinct to confront was still there. She could see it in his jaw, in the set of his shoulders when he came in from finding something new. But he was channeling it into documentation the way she'd asked, controlled force of a man applying physical energy to a task his body wasn't built for, but his mind had decided was necessary. She was grateful for that in a way she didn't put into words, because putting it into words felt like counting something she might still lose. The account book was filling up. She'd started a second ledger specifically for incidents, not the financial accounts, but a chronological record of every act of damage or interference, with dates and descriptions, and where possible, witness information. Thomas Reel at the Mercantile had seen a group of men he recognized as Cross's ranch hands passing through town on the morning the equipment shed was damaged. She asked him if he'd write that down and sign it. He was quiet for a moment, the same calculating quiet she'd seen in Berta Halverson, and then he said yes. "He's going to know you told me," she said. "He already doesn't give me his supply business," Thomas said. "Thinks my prices are too high. He buys from Cartwright over in the next county." He pulled out a piece of paper and his pen. "Tell me what you need it to say." She told him. He wrote it. She witnessed it and folded it into the ledger. The summer contract with the Millhaven camp came through in July. 80 pounds of dried beans per month, 40 pounds of preserved squash, a standing order through October. The camp manager, a terse Scotsman named Drummond, had met with Evelyn twice before signing, and she'd brought the numbers both times, clean and clear, and without exaggeration, and he'd checked them against his current costs and said, with the brevity of someone who made decisions for a living, "All right, first delivery by the 15th. The first delivery was made on the 14th. She believed in margins. Gideon drove the wagon. She sat beside him on the bench seat with the account folder and the contract and watched the land go by for 40 miles and thought about how different the same territory looked from a position of momentum versus a position of retreat. It looked the same, obviously. The land didn't change, but something in the way she looked at it had changed, and she suspected something in the way he looked at it had changed too. "Drummond will tell other camp managers," she said, somewhere around the 20-mile mark. "If we deliver what we promised." "We will. I need you to order the extra seed stock this week. If we're supplying Millhaven through October and one of the eastern camps expands their order," "Already planned to," he said. She looked at him. He was watching the road with the concentrated attention he gave to anything he took seriously, which was most things. She'd been noticing this in pieces, in the same way she noticed all things, accumulating them until the pattern became clear, more than she'd initially understood. She'd understood from the first night that he wasn't the man the town had decided he was. But the man he actually was had been revealing itself in layers, the way the pasture soil had revealed itself, slowly, over weeks of working it. He was precise. He was stubborn in the way that had a productive application when pointed at the right problem. He had a dry, spare wit that emerged only occasionally, and usually, at the moment you least expected it. He was honest in a way that was structural rather than performed. He didn't choose honesty because he thought it made him look good. He chose it because he genuinely didn't seem to know how to be otherwise, and the few times he had tried to smooth something over, she could see the discomfort it caused him. He was also, she'd been acknowledging to herself lately, watching her in a way that had changed from the early weeks. The first weeks, he'd watched her work the way you watched someone you weren't sure about, assessing, waiting to see whether the picture held. Now he watched her differently, less assessment, more, she didn't have a precise word for it, attention that wasn't functional, the kind that notices things it doesn't need to notice. She filed this away and didn't act on it, because she was 16 and she'd been in this arrangement for 5 months. And there was a great deal at stake, and she was not going to make assumptions about what she saw in a man's face. Harold Cross made his next move in August. It came through the county land office, a formal dispute filing claiming that the eastern boundary of the Blackridge property overlapped with a survey marker that Cross's representatives said had been moved. The claim was documented with a survey report from a man named Beaumont, who was, Evelyn discovered after 2 days of inquiry, employed by a land management company in which Harold Cross held a financial interest. She read the filing 3 times, and then she sat with it for an hour, not reading but thinking. Then she went to find Gideon, who was in the equipment shed, and she told him what the filing said and what she'd found out about Beaumont. He was quiet for longer than usual. "The marker hasn't moved," he said. "That boundary line has been in the same place since my father surveyed it." "I know," she said. "Do you have the original survey documents?" A pause. "My father's papers. They're in a box in the back room." They spent that evening going through the box. It was not an easy evening. The papers were mixed with other things, personal things, letters and photographs and the accumulated material of a life, and she could see what it cost him to go through them with her there. She tried to be efficient without being cold, handling each item quickly and setting the irrelevant ones aside with respect. He didn't say anything about it, but he also didn't ask her to slow down or to leave, which she took as permission to continue. The original survey was there, dated 1861, signed by the county surveyor of that period, with a hand-drawn map that showed the eastern boundary markers with compass bearings and distances. She laid it on the table next to the filing Beaumont had submitted. The numbers were different, not dramatically, by 30 feet, on a stretch of boundary line that ran for half a mile. But 30 feet in the right place meant the small creek that ran along the eastern edge, the one that fed the water trough for the south pasture. "He's after the water," Gideon said. "He's always been after the water," she said. "He just found a new way to try." She looked at the original survey for a long time. Then she looked at the account book with its months of documented incidents. Then she looked at Gideon. "I need to go to the county seat," she said, "with the original survey and the incident ledger and Thomas Reel's statement and Berta Halverson's statement. I'm going to ask her for one." She paused. "And I need to know if there are any other families who have had boundary issues or water issues with Harold Cross in the last 10 years. "There are," he said. "At least 2 that I know of. One sold, one—" He stopped. "One left. Couldn't prove anything. Can I talk to them?" "The family that left moved to the next county." "Can you get me an introduction?" He looked at her with something that was, she thought, very close to admiration, though he wore it carefully, the way he wore everything. "I can try," he said. "Good." She closed the incident ledger. "We're also going to keep planting. Whatever else happens, we keep the operation running. If we stop, it looks like we're worried. If we keep going, it looks like we're not." "Are we worried?" he asked. She considered the honest answer. "Yes," she said, "but I'm not going to let that be the loudest thing." The county seat was a 2-day ride. She went with Gideon on a Monday, arrived Wednesday morning, and spent 3 hours at the land registry office going through records that the clerk, a young man named Adkins, pulled for her with the mild bewilderment of someone not accustomed to visitors who knew exactly what they were looking for. She found 2 prior boundary disputes involving Cross. One had resulted in a settlement, the other family's signature on a land transfer that Evelyn suspected had been signed under conditions not entirely unlike the ones she was currently facing. The other had been quietly dropped after the disputing family left the county. She asked Adkins for copies of both. He made them slowly, with the pen of a man who was not going to be rushed, and she sat in the hard chair beside his desk and read the county records while she waited and found one more thing she hadn't been looking for, a filing from 4 years ago in which Beaumont, the same surveyor Harold Cross was using now, had been cited for an inaccurate survey report in a dispute in the neighboring county. The citation had not resulted in any formal action, but it was there, in the official record, with a date and a signature. She asked for a copy of that too. Adkins looked at her. He was perhaps 22, and he had the particular expression of a person slowly revising a first impression. "Can I ask what you're building?" he said. "A record," she said. "The same kind your office keeps." He made the copy. She brought everything home and spread it on the kitchen table and organized it chronologically, from the first incident in April to the boundary filing in August, with the supporting documents beside each entry. Gideon sat across from her and watched her work, and when she was done, he looked at the assembled record for a long time without speaking. "That's a case," he said. "It's the beginning of one," she said. "We need to find a lawyer." "In this county?" "No," she said. "The next one. Someone who doesn't owe Harold Cross a favor." She found the lawyer through Berta Halverson, who knew everyone and owed explanations to no one. His name was Calloway, and he was 60 and lean and had the manner of a man who had been in enough courtrooms to have stopped being impressed by any of them. He came to the ranch on a Thursday and sat at the kitchen table and read through everything Evelyn had assembled, and the only sound for 40 minutes was the occasional turn of a page. When he finished, he looked up at her. "How old are you?" 16, she said. He looked at Gideon. "She put this together?" "Yes," Gideon said. Calloway looked back at Evelyn. "The Beaumont citation is the linchpin," he said. "If his credibility as a surveyor can be impeached, combined with the original survey documents and the pattern of prior disputes," she said, "it suggests the boundary filing is not a mistake." "It suggests it's a tactic," he said. "Yes." He sat back. "Cross has a lawyer in this county. Good one." "I know," she said. "That's why we need one in the next county." The smallest possible movement passed across his face. Not quite a smile, but the precursor to one. The expression of a man who is finding something unexpectedly interesting. "What do you want to do with this?" he said. "Defend the filing or press for something larger?" She looked at the assembled documents. She thought about the boot prints in the bean rows in April, the cut wire, the tainted water trough, the carefully constructed story of Gideon Blackridge that had let people use his barn as a punishment for years without anyone having to take responsibility for it. She thought about the girl in the next county who had signed a land transfer under conditions nobody had looked too closely at. "Both," she said. "I want to defend the filing and I want everything else on record, formally, so it can't disappear." Calloway looked at the documents again. "This will take time," he said. "Months, possibly longer. He'll escalate while it's pending." "I know," she said. "So will we." She said it without drama, and meant it entirely. And when she looked across the table at Gideon, she found him looking back at her with the expression she'd been accumulating over months. Not the assessment look, not the wonder look, but something that sat beneath both of those, quieter and more permanent, the look of a man who has found something he didn't know he was still looking for. She looked back at him for a moment, just a moment, before returning to the documents. The work was not finished. It was barely started. Harold Cross was not going to stop because they'd hired a lawyer and written things down. He was going to test every edge of what they'd built and look for the places where the construction wasn't solid. She knew that. She'd known it since April, since the boot prints in the bean rows, since the moment she'd understood that this was not random difficulty, but engineered difficulty, designed specifically to find the limit of what she and Gideon were willing to endure. She had known her whole life that the question was never whether the difficulty would come. The question was what you were made of when it did. She gathered the documents back into their folder and tied the string that held it closed and put it on the shelf where she kept the things that mattered. And she went to start supper. And the stove was warm and the south pasture was growing and the account books were both full and outside the light was going gold across the land that had both their names on it. That was real. Everything else was a problem to be solved, and she had never yet run out of patience for problems that could be solved by thinking hard and writing things down and refusing to stop. She was 17 now, as of 2 weeks ago. She had not made a great event of the birthday, but Gideon had come in from the pasture that morning with a small bunch of wildflowers he had cut somewhere along the fence line, and he'd set them in the tin cup on the table without ceremony and said, "Happy birthday," in the same voice he used to discuss the price of seed stock. She had looked at the flowers in the tin cup for a moment. "Thank you," she said, and meant it in a way that was larger than the words, though she trusted he understood that, because he generally did. He had understood her, she was finding, in the incremental and imperfect and real way that two people understood each other when they worked side by side toward the same thing and were honest about what they were and weren't. It wasn't a story, It had gaps and silences and things that weren't resolved. But it was growing, the same way the South Pasture was growing. Not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily, in the direction of the light. Calloway filed the counter-response to Harold's boundary dispute in the second week of September, and the filing landed in the county land office with the particular weight of a document that had been built carefully over months rather than assembled in a hurry. Evelyn knew it was a good filing because Calloway, who was not a man who said things he didn't mean, had looked at it before he sent it and said, "This is solid." He didn't add anything to that, which told her it was more than solid. Harold Cross's lawyer, a man named Fetters, who worked out of the county seat and had the smooth, unhurried confidence of someone accustomed to winning by virtue of who his clients were, filed a response within 2 weeks. Evelyn read it twice at the kitchen table and then set it down and looked at the wall. "What does it say?" Gideon asked. "It says Beaumont's prior citation was administrative and doesn't bear on his professional credibility. It says the original survey documents we submitted may have been altered. And it says," she picked it up again and found the line, "that given Mr. Blackridge's history of antisocial behavior and hostility toward neighboring landowners, the court should weigh the credibility of the claimants accordingly." The room was quiet. "He's calling us liars," Gideon said. "He's preparing the ground to call us liars," she said. "It's different. He doesn't have the evidence yet, so he's planting the suggestion early." She put the filing in the folder with the others. "He's also trying to bait you. The antisocial behavior line. He wants you to react to it in a way he can point to." Gideon's jaw was doing the thing it did. "I know what he's doing. I know you know. I'm saying it out loud anyway because it helps me think." He exhaled. "What do we do?" "We give Calloway everything we have on the original survey, every piece of paper that can establish its provenance. Your father's signature, the county surveyor's seal, the date. We need to make it impossible to call it altered without calling the entire county land registry into question." She stood up and went to the shelf where the documents lived. "And I'm going to write to the county that issued the Beaumont citation. Ask for the full record of that proceeding, not just the outcome notation." "Will they send it?" "They might, if I ask correctly." She pulled out the second ledger. "I'm also going to ask Calloway whether there's a mechanism to depose Beaumont directly. Make him describe his methodology under oath and in writing." Gideon watched her pull papers. He had that look, the steady, attending look that wasn't assessment anymore, that she'd stopped trying to name precisely and had just started accepting as the way he looked at her. "You never stop," he said. It wasn't a complaint. "No," she said. "I don't know how." October moved in cold and busy. The Millhaven contract delivered its 4th monthly order on schedule, and Drummond sent back a letter with the payment that said, "In full, consistent product, good weight, interested in extending through spring." She wrote back the same day and said they could discuss terms at his convenience, and please find enclosed their proposed pricing for the extended period. The cooperative had expanded to 6 families by October. The Okafor Millers had brought in a cousin who ranched 15 miles south, and Berta Halverson had quietly convinced a 4th family, the Sunstroms, who had been burned by a bad purchasing arrangement the previous year and were cautious about everything, to join. Evelyn ran the combined orders and kept the books for the whole arrangement, which added hours to her week that she did not have. And she did it anyway because the cooperative was load-bearing in a way that went beyond the financial savings. It was a web of relationships, and relationships were the thing Harold Cross could not easily destroy with boot prints in a bean field. He was still trying to destroy other things. In October, it was the equipment shed again. The roof they'd repaired after the June rain was found partially dismantled one morning, not damaged by weather, but by hands. The shingles stacked in a way that made clear someone had climbed up and removed them deliberately. Gideon found it and came directly to the account ledger without being asked, which said something about how far they'd come from April. She documented it. Date, description, estimated repair cost, notation that it had been repaired previously in June following prior interference. She asked Pell the blacksmith if he'd ride out to look at the roof and give a professional assessment of whether the damage was consistent with weathering or deliberate removal. Pell came out the following day, looked at the stacked shingles and the pattern of removal, and said, with the directness of a man who didn't see the point of hedging, "That's not wind." She asked him to write that down and sign it. He wrote, "Inspected roof of equipment shed at Blackridge Ranch, October 14th. Damage pattern inconsistent with weather. shingles removed by hand. He signed it. She put it in the ledger. The ledger was getting thick. She had started keeping it in the locked box under the bed, the one that also held the marriage document and the ranch deed and the original survey papers, because she had begun to understand that the ledger itself was a target. If Harold Cross's men understood what she was building, the record would be the first thing they'd try to eliminate. She didn't share this concern with Gideon immediately, but she did start making copies. The copies were tedious. She did them at night, after supper, by lamp, her hand moving carefully across the page and reproducing each entry as precisely as she could manage. Gideon asked her once what she was doing, and she told him, and he was quiet for a moment and then said, "Where are you keeping the copies?" "I was going to ask Calloway to hold one set," she said, "and give one to Berta Halverson." "Not in the same county," he said. She looked up. He was right. If any legal action in this county went badly, records held locally might be subject to interference through channels she couldn't anticipate. "The family in the next county," she said. "The one that left. If you've made contact." "I wrote to them last month," he said. "They wrote back. The husband, Anders, he'll talk to us." "Can we go before the snow?" "If we leave next week?" They left the following Monday, which was the last genuinely mild day before the weather turned. Gideon drove. She brought the second copy of the ledger in a waxed canvas folder and the letter Anders had sent, which was careful and guarded in the way of someone who had been hurt and was not in any hurry to be hurt again. The Brandt family, Anders and his wife Lena, lived 45 miles east in a small farmstead that was tidier than the land around it suggested it had any right to be. The kind of upkeep that came from people who refused to let circumstances show on the surface. Anders was perhaps 45, with a limp from an old injury that he moved around with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd long since stopped being inconvenienced by it. Lena met them at the door and looked at Evelyn with the particular thoroughness of a woman taking a measure, and then stood aside and let them in. She put coffee on without asking. Evelyn respected that. They sat at the kitchen table, and Anders looked at the canvas folder and said, "You've been keeping records." "Since April," Evelyn said. "We didn't," he said. That was our mistake. We thought—" He stopped, looked at his hands. "We thought being right was enough." "Being right isn't enough," she said. "Not against someone with that much patience." He looked at her. Something in his face moved that was private and old. "No," he said, "it isn't." He talked for 2 hours. Lena filled in the gaps. She had the sharper memory for specific dates, specific words said by specific people, the way women often did because they'd learned early that the details were what you'd need later, and men sometimes didn't know what to save. Evelyn took notes. She asked questions that went after the things that could be documented: witnesses, transactions, anything that had left a physical record, even if no one had thought to preserve it at the time. There was a payment. A land transfer signed by Anders under circumstances he described carefully, his voice controlled and deliberate, in the way of someone who had gone over this many times in private. He'd been told, he said, that a survey error had been found, the same Beaumont-style argument, the same manufactured pressure, and that the alternative to settling quietly was a legal proceeding that would cost more than the land was worth and take longer than his family could endure. He'd signed, they'd moved, and afterwards he'd learned through a neighbor that the parcel he'd sold had been incorporated into Cross's water management system within 6 months. He looked at Evelyn when he finished. "What can you do with any of this?" he said. "It was 4 years ago. I signed." "I'm not sure yet," she said honestly, "but it establishes a pattern. Same surveyor, same pressure strategy, same timing in relation to water access. A pattern is different from an incident." She looked at the notes she'd taken. "Would you be willing to sign a statement describing what you've told me today, with Lena's account as well?" A long silence. Lena and Anders exchanged the look of people who had been making hard decisions together for a long time. "If it's going to be used carefully," Anders said, "not just thrown into something and lost." "It will go to Calloway," she said. "He's the lawyer handling our case. He'll know how to use it correctly. And I'll keep a copy here, with you, so you have it regardless of what happens with us." Another exchange of looks. "All right," Anders said. "Yes." She and Gideon drove home in the dark, the first hour in silence, the kind that followed a long and heavy conversation. The stars were out, hard and clear and indifferent to everything happening beneath them. He's going to do something bigger, Gideon said eventually. Harold, the boundary filing is taking too long for him. He'll try something else. I think so too, she said. He's been patient for 7 years, but patience has a limit, and we've been moving faster than he expected. She looked at the road ahead. The question is whether he moves before or after the hearing. The land dispute hearing was set for November. Calloway had managed to get a judge from outside the county assigned to it, which was a small but meaningful victory. A local judge would have had relationships with Harold Cross that a visiting judge wouldn't. The visiting judge was named Harker, and Calloway reported that he had a reputation for thoroughness and an intolerance for waste of his time. Harold moved in the 3rd week of October. He moved at the cooperative. The Sundstrom family, the cautious ones, the ones who'd joined last and still held themselves slightly apart from the others, received a visit from 2 men who represented themselves as agents of a supply company offering them a private purchasing arrangement at prices substantially below what the cooperative was currently paying. The prices were, Evelyn calculated when Berta told her, below the actual cost of the goods at wholesale. They were not real prices. They were an offer designed to fracture the cooperative from the inside, pull one family out, and then almost certainly fail to deliver on the promised terms once the damage was done. The Sundstroms, to their credit, came to Berta before they accepted. Berta came to Evelyn. Evelyn sat with the numbers the Sunstroms had been offered and looked at them for a while. Then she wrote out a comparison, current cooperative prices versus the offered prices versus what those goods would actually cost to source and transport, and gave it to Berta to take back to the Sunstroms. Tell them to look at the transportation cost, she said. There's no supply company operating in this territory that can move goods at that price after transport. Either the quality is not what they're representing, or the offer disappears after 1 or 2 deliveries, or both. Berta took the comparison. 2 days later, she came back and said the Sunstroms had declined the offer. The men had come back once more with a revised proposal, and the Sunstroms had shown them the door. Evelyn wrote this in the ledger. Date, description, names of the men as the Sunstroms had provided them. She sent the entry to Calloway with a note. Possible attempt to interfere with business relationships of associated families. Names attached. Please advise whether this is documentable as part of the pattern. Calloway wrote back, yes. Add it to the record. I want originals by the end of the month. November came. The hearing was set for the 12th. The night before, Evelyn sat at the kitchen table and went through the folder one more time. Not because there was anything to add or change, but because she needed to hold the whole thing in her mind at once, feel its weight, make sure nothing was missing. Gideon sat across from her and let her do it, nursing a cup of tea that had gone cold 20 minutes ago. You're not going to sleep, he said. Probably not. You should try. I know. She turned a page. I will. In a while. He was quiet. Then, Evelyn. She looked up. Whatever happens tomorrow, he said. What you've built here, the record, the cooperative, Calloway, the Brants, that doesn't go away even if the hearing doesn't go how we want. You understand that? She looked at him. He wasn't saying it to comfort her. She knew the difference between comfort and honest assessment by now, and this was the latter. He was telling her something true. I know, she said, but I'd like to win tomorrow. So would I, he said. I'm just saying, whatever you walked into this with, it wasn't any of this. You built it. She held his gaze for a moment. There were things in what he'd said that she was going to need to sit with later, privately, in the way she sat with things that were large enough to require more than a moment's consideration. She put that aside for now. Go to sleep, she said. One of us should. He went. She sat for another hour and then she closed the folder and went to bed and lay in the dark and listened to the house settle around her. And sometime before the first light she did sleep, briefly, and dreamed of nothing she could remember afterward. The hearing was held in the county seat, in a building that served as courthouse and land registry and postal office on alternating days, and smelled accordingly of paper and old wood and the particular anxiety of civic proceedings. Judge Harker was a compact man in his 60s with a gray beard trimmed close and eyes that moved over documents with the speed of someone who read faster than most people thought and retained everything. He did not look at either party with any particular warmth or suspicion, which Evelyn found genuinely reassuring. Fetters presented first, on Harold Cross's behalf. How was smooth and organized and built his argument the way a skilled advocate built arguments, starting with the conclusion he wanted the judge to reach, and then arranging the evidence to support it, managing the Beaumont citation with a series of minimizing adjectives that were technically accurate but cumulatively misleading. Evelyn listened and made notes and kept her face neutral. Calloway presented second. He was not smooth, he was precise, which was different and better in front of a judge who could read. He walked Harker through the original survey and its provenance, the discrepancy between Beaumont's report and the documented measurements, the Beaumont citation, and the full record from the neighboring county that Evelyn had obtained by letter, and the Brant family's signed statement describing a materially identical sequence of events 4 years prior. Fetters objected to the Brant statement as irrelevant. Harker looked at it for a moment and said, "It's relevant to pattern. Overruled." Evelyn wrote down, "Harker, overruled, pattern." Harker asked 2 questions of Calloway and 3 of Fetters, all of them specific and technical, and pointing at the same thing, the gap between what Beaumont's survey said and what the original documents established. Fetters answered the 3rd question with a qualification that landed wrong. She could feel it, a slight over-elaboration that happened when an advocate knew the ground under a particular point was soft. Harker recessed for 2 hours. She and Gideon and Calloway sat in the anteroom, and Calloway drank a cup of coffee and said nothing, which she'd come to understand was his version of optimism. Harker's ruling was 7 pages. She read it standing at the clerk's window while Gideon read over her shoulder, and the first paragraph established the standard he was applying, a preponderance of physical documentary evidence. And the second paragraph said that the original survey documents, supported by county registry records, and the chain of provenance Calloway had established, constituted that preponderance. The boundary dispute was dismissed. Beaumont's survey report was formally noted as inconsistent with the established record and referred to the Territorial Surveying Board for review of his professional credentials. The Cross family was ordered to pay the legal costs of the proceeding. She stood at the clerk's window and read it twice, and then handed it back for copying and stood very still for a moment, feeling the size of what she was feeling without immediately doing anything with it. Gideon put his hand on her shoulder, briefly, just for a moment, and then took it back. She appreciated the brevity of it. Calloway tucked his copy under his arm. "That's a good result," he said. "Not the end of anything, but a good result." "What happens now?" Gideon asked. "Now we see how he responds." Calloway looked at them both. Men like Harold Cross don't stop because of a single adverse ruling, but a single adverse ruling that's on the public record, combined with a pattern of documented incidents, changes the calculation. "Changes it how?" Evelyn asked. "Makes the next move riskier for him. Right now, anyone who looks at this sees a boundary dispute that went to hearing and was dismissed on the evidence. If he escalates further and we can connect it to this pattern, the exposure for him gets larger. He's been used to operating in a space where nothing was written down." He looked at her. "That space doesn't exist anymore." They drove home in the afternoon light, and Evelyn held the copy of the ruling in her lap and thought about what came next, because there was always a next, and she had never learned to let herself stop at a result. What came next arrived sooner than Calloway had implied it might. 2 weeks after the ruling, a man named Cutter, one of Cross's ranch hands, a thin, sun-damaged man in his late 30s, who had been on the payroll for at least 4 years based on what Evelyn had learned from her months of quiet inquiry, appeared at Thomas Reel's store and told Thomas, apparently in some confidence that he should have known a man like Thomas would not keep, that he was looking for other employment. He was specific about why. Harold Cross had told him and 2 others to go back to the Blackridge fence line and do something more significant this time, and Cutter had declined. He wasn't a lawyer, he said, and he didn't know exactly what was and wasn't legal, but he'd been reading what people were saying in town about the November hearing, and he didn't want to be named in a document somewhere. Thomas Reel sent a boy to the ranch the same afternoon. Evelyn went to see Cutter herself the following morning at the boarding house where he'd taken a room. He was uncomfortable from the moment she sat down across from him, which was the discomfort of a man who had not expected to be taken seriously by the person who showed up, and she let him be uncomfortable for a moment before she spoke. "I'm not here to put you in anything," she said. "I just want to know what you can tell me." He told her, with the halting cadence of a man who was editing as he went, keeping back the parts he thought implicated him most directly. She let him edit. What came through even the edited version was enough. Specific instructions from Harold Cross, a specific timeline, a specific escalation from the general harassment of the previous months toward something more deliberately destructive. Cutter used the phrase, "make an example," twice. He said Harold had used those exact words. "Would you be willing to sign a statement?" she asked. He looked at his hands. "What happens to me if I do?" "I don't know exactly," she said. "I can tell you what I think happens. It becomes part of a legal record that's already significant, and that record is going to end up in front of people who have the authority to act on it. If you're in the record as a witness rather than a participant, that's a different position than if you're not in the record at all, and your name comes up anyway." He chewed on that. "You think it's going to go further, beyond the county?" "I think Harold Cross has been doing this long enough, and to enough people that it's not going to stay contained," she said. "That's what the pattern documentation is for." A long silence. The boarding house around them was making its ordinary sounds. Someone moving in a room above, the distant clatter of the kitchen. Ordinary life, going on around a conversation that was anything but. "All right," he said. "Yes." She wrote the statement herself, in plain language that stuck to what he'd said and didn't elaborate. And she read it back to him sentence by sentence, and he made 2 corrections and then signed it. She witnessed it. She had a copy made at the Mercantile before she left town. When she got home and told Gideon, he was quiet for a moment and then said, "One of his own men." "Men don't like to be in the path of something they can see is coming," she said. Cutter could see it. "What is coming?" She put the signed statement in the folder. "I'm going to write to the Territorial Land Authority," she said. "Not the county. The territory level. With the full record, the incidents, the Brandt statement, Cutter's statement, the dismissed boundary dispute, the Beaumont referral. All of it." She looked at him. "This is too large for the county level now. It's been too large for a while." He looked at the folder. "You've been building to this since April." "Since April," she confirmed. "Yes." A beat of quiet. He came and stood beside her and looked at the folder with her, and she was aware of his presence beside her in the particular way she'd become aware of it over months. Not disruptive, not demanding anything, just there. Solid. "What do you need from me?" he said. "I need you to sign the cover letter with me. Joint submission. Both names on it, both of us as claimants." She looked up at him. "And I need you to be patient for a little longer." "I've been patient," he said. "I think I've been quite remarkably patient." "You have," she said. "I know." She wrote the letter to the Territorial Authority over 2 evenings, drafting and revising and refining until it was the clearest, most accurate account she could make it. Not emotional, not inflammatory, just a precise narrative of documented events supported by the evidence assembled over 8 months. She laid out the pattern. She named the names. She cited the evidence by date and by the witness or document that supported each entry. She asked for a formal investigation into Harold Cross's conduct toward neighboring landowners and into Beaumont's professional activities in the territory. She read the final version to Gideon at the kitchen table. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then, "You're asking them to investigate a man who owns more land than most of them have ever seen." "Yes." "That takes something." "The record takes something," she said. "I'm just attaching a letter to the record." She set it down. "The record does the asking." He signed it. She signed it below his name. She sent it with the full annex documentation, the entire second ledger copied by hand, the Brandt statement, the Cutter statement, Thomas Reel's statement, Pell's roof assessment, and the dismissed boundary ruling with Harker's annotations. The envelope was thick enough that the postmaster looked at it twice. She paid the postage and walked out into the cold December air and stood on the boardwalk for a moment, looking at Ash Hollow crossing around her. The same town that had sent her to a frozen barn 11 months ago. The same buildings and the same faces and the same social architecture of money and power and who got to decide what. And she breathed in the cold and felt the weight of what she'd sent lift slightly and redistribute itself into the space ahead of her, where she couldn't see it yet. Gideon was waiting with the wagon. She climbed up beside him. "Done," she said. "Done," he agreed and turned the horses for home. But the actual end of it came not from the Territorial Authority's response, which was still months away, but from a direction she hadn't anticipated. from inside Harold Cross's own operation, in January, when two more men came forward. Not to Evelyn this time, but to the county sheriff, a man named Briggs who had always navigated carefully between the Cross family's influence and his own nominal authority. What changed Briggs's navigation was that one of the two men was not a ranch hand but a former bookkeeper who had kept Cross's private accounts for 3 years, and who had, for reasons of his own that Evelyn never learned in full, decided that he was done carrying what he'd been carrying. The bookkeeper's name was Fenwick. He went to Briggs with specific financial records showing payments made to Beaumont that predated the boundary survey by 18 months, payments categorized in the accounts as consulting fees, but with no corresponding documentation of services. He also had records of payments to the two men who had approached the Sundstrom family with the fraudulent supply offer. Briggs, faced with documentary evidence that went beyond anything he could manage with careful navigation, sent for the county judge. The county judge, aware that the territorial authority had already received a formal complaint, was not inclined to be on the wrong side of what was becoming a documented record in multiple jurisdictions. They brought Harold Cross in for a formal proceeding in February. Evelyn and Gideon were not present for the proceeding itself. They weren't asked to be, the machine of formal authority having taken the record she'd built and begun operating on its own momentum. Calloway attended and sent a letter afterward that was the longest she'd received from him, which meant it had been a significant day. Harold Cross did not go to prison. The territory's legal mechanisms were imprecise, and the charges that could be formally substantiated were narrower than the full scope of what he'd done. But he paid restitution. A formal order required compensation for documented property damage to the Blackridge Ranch, indexed to the valuations in her incident ledger. The Brandt family received a separate settlement. Beaumont lost his surveying credentials in 3 counties. 2 of Cross's men entered formal arrangements with the sheriff's office that Calloway described as making them significantly unavailable for future paid mischief. And Harold Cross signed an agreement, under the oversight of the county court, permanently abandoning any claim to the Blackridge water access or eastern boundary. Calloway delivered the signed agreement to the ranch on a Thursday afternoon in late February. He handed it to Evelyn, not to Gideon. She read it at the kitchen table with the same care she read everything, starting from the beginning and not skipping to the part she was afraid of, and then she set it down on top of the incident ledger, the 2 documents together, and pressed her palms flat against them for a moment. Calloway accepted a cup of coffee. He sat across from her and said, "The territorial authority acknowledged your submission, by the way, formally. It's in their record." "Good," she said. "That matters more than this proceeding in some ways. It means anyone who looks at Harold Cross's history in this territory will find your name in the record of the complaint that prompted the investigation." He turned his cup. "That's permanent." She nodded. She understood what he was telling her and why it mattered. Not the winning, but the record of how it had been won, the chain of documentation that made it impossible to revisit or revise. The truth, fixed in the official record, in multiple copies, in multiple jurisdictions. Not her word against his anymore. After Calloway left, she and Gideon stood on the porch in the late winter afternoon and looked at the south pasture, which was asleep under a thin crust of snow, but was there, present, real. The fence line was intact, had been intact since December. She was 17 years old. She had been in Ash Hollow Crossing for 14 months, and 11 of those months she had spent building the thing that had just ended Harold Cross's campaign against them, piece by piece, date by date, in columns that added up to something no one could take away. "The East Camps," she said. "When the ground thaws, I want to plant twice what we planted last year. We have the seed stock." "I know," he said. "I already ordered more." She looked at him. He was looking at the pasture, or appearing to, but she'd known him long enough to understand when he was appearing to look at something while actually thinking about something else entirely. "Gideon," she said. He looked at her. There was a long moment, the kind that contains more than whatever gets said inside it. She had been filing things away for months. The tin cup of wildflowers, the hand on her shoulder at the clerk's window, the look across the kitchen table that wasn't assessment anymore. And the file had gotten quite full. "Thank you," she said. "For January, the barn, coming back when you did." He was quiet for a moment. "You would have figured something out," he said, "even if I hadn't." "Maybe," she said, "but I didn't have to." He looked at her with that gray, steady regard, and what was in it was not complicated, even though getting to it had been. No, he said quietly. You didn't. The cold sat around them, ordinary and clean, and the south pasture waited under its thin snow, and somewhere in the account ledger on the shelf inside was the record of everything it had cost to get to this Thursday afternoon on this porch, in this particular silence. And the silence was, she found, the best kind. The kind that didn't need filling because what was in it was already enough. The snow melted in the way it always did in that part of the territory. Not all at once, but in argument with itself, retreating from the south-facing slopes first, while the shaded ground held its frost stubbornly into March, as if the cold had decided that surrender required negotiation. Evelyn watched it go from the kitchen window each morning while the coffee heated, cataloging the progress the way she cataloged everything. Not because she needed to, but because watching things change incrementally was the only way she knew to understand change at all. The south pasture emerged from its snow cover looking better than she'd expected. The bean rows from the previous season had been turned under properly in October, and the soil had a different quality now, darker, more yielding when she pushed a finger into it, from a full season of being worked. She stood at the edge of it on the first genuinely warm day in March, and felt the ground through the soles of her boots, and thought about the girl who had knelt here the previous April, hands dark with soil for the first time in her life, and felt something close to contentment. She was not that girl anymore. She was not entirely sure what she was instead, except that it occupied more space. Gideon found her standing there and stood beside her without asking what she was thinking, which was one of the things about him that she had stopped taking for granted. He had a quality of companionable silence that she had initially thought was simply reserve, and had gradually come to understand was something more deliberate, a decision to be present without demanding anything of the presence, which was rarer than it sounded and worth more than most people knew. Drummond sent a letter, he said. I saw it. He wants to extend through next winter. Can we supply that? She looked at the pasture. If the East Field produces like I think it will, and we get the Halverson cooperative order consolidated by May, yes. She turned to look at him. I also want to talk to you about the preserving operation. I think we've been undercharging. He looked at her sideways. You think everything we've been doing has been undercharging. That's because it has been. We set the initial prices to build relationships. The relationships are built. She turned back to the pasture. It's time to charge what the product is worth. He was quiet for a moment. Berta's going to say the same thing to you that she said in November. Berta said in November that my prices were too low and I should charge more. Yes, he said. So you'll agree with each other. She almost smiled at that. Not quite, but close enough that he noticed it. She could tell from the slight shift in his expression. They had been doing this for several months now, this particular dance of almost humor, the dry and careful exchange of people who had gotten to know each other's edges well enough to navigate them comfortably. It was not what she would have predicted back in January of the previous year, sitting on a barn floor in the dark. But then very little of what her life had become was what she would have predicted then. The new worker arrived in April. His name was Tomas, and he was 14, and he came to the ranch the way Evelyn had come to Ash Hollow Crossing, by necessity, with nothing in his hands and the particular combination of wariness and determination she recognized because she had worn it herself. He had been working at the Cross Ranch, one of the outer operations, not Harold's main holdings, until the restitution proceedings had rippled through Harold's finances and the outer operations had shed workers first. He had heard, from someone in town, that the Blackridge Ranch was hiring. Gideon had looked at him standing on the porch and said, "How old are you?" 16, Tomas said, which was not true by approximately 2 years, and Gideon had looked at him with the expression of a man deciding whether to address a specific untruth or the larger truth it was concealing. Evelyn, standing in the kitchen doorway, said, "Can you mend fence?" Tomas looked at her. "Yes." "Can you do it without being told where the problems are? Can you walk a fence line and find them yourself?" A brief pause. "Yes." "Can you drive a wagon team?" "Yes." "Can you read?" He hesitated. "Some." "That's enough," she said. "Come in and eat something and we'll talk about what the work is." Gideon had looked at her after Tomas went inside, with an expression that asked a question without committing to it. "He's 14, she said, before he could speak. "I know. He needs somewhere to be that isn't the road." I know that too. Gideon looked at the door the boy had gone through. I'm not arguing. Good, she said, and went inside. Tomas worked hard in the specific way that people worked hard when they were trying to prove something they couldn't say directly, pouring effort into visible tasks because effort was the currency they had. She watched him without appearing to watch him and saw the things he was good at. A genuine instinct for the land, a patience with animals that was not learned but native, and the things he was covering for, the gaps in his knowledge that he tried to bridge with speed and willingness. She showed him the ledger system at the end of his first week, walking him through it simply, without condescension, treating his partial reading as a skill to be built on rather than a deficiency to be managed. He looked at the ledger for a long time. You wrote all of this? Every entry, she said. Date, description, amount. Everything that happens on this ranch goes in here. Why? Because what's written down is harder to argue with than what someone remembers, she said, and because a record shows you what's real. People tell themselves stories about what's happening. The numbers tell you what's actually happening. He looked at a column of entries. This is from April last year. Yes, the first fence damage. I knew about that, he said quietly. I was at the cross operation then. I heard men talk about it. She looked at him. He was looking at the ledger and not at her, which she understood was how someone looked when they were telling you something difficult. Were you involved? She asked. Directly, without softening it, because she had found that young people generally preferred directness to the implied accusation of a question that danced around what it meant. No, he said. I was on the cattle side. I wouldn't have done that. He finally looked up. But I knew it was happening, and I didn't say anything. She sat with that for a moment. It was an honest answer, the kind that a less careful person might have omitted from their account entirely, or wrapped in qualifications that diluted it. He'd chosen not to do that, and the choice said something about him that the mended fence line and the well-driven wagon already suggested. You're saying it now, she said. I guess I am. Then it's in the record, she said. You told me. It's noted. She closed the ledger. Now let me show you how to write an inventory column. He stayed. That was the simple fact of it. He stayed, and he learned the fence lines and the pasture schedules and the names of the cattle and the ledger system. And by June, he was writing his own inventory entries in a hand that was slow but accurate, and Evelyn corrected his spelling without making a ceremony of it, and he accepted the corrections the same way. Gideon taught him to ride properly. The boy could sit a horse, but riding and sitting were different things, and Gideon had the patience for instruction when he believed in the student, which she had observed was one of the qualities he kept private because he wasn't sure it was useful, and she had come to think it was one of his best. She caught them once, in May, out by the east fence, Gideon demonstrating something about the angle of the reins with the matter-of-fact specificity of a man who had thought about this precise thing many times and had clear opinions about it, and Tomas listening with the total attention of a young person who wanted very badly to be good at something and had found someone worth learning from. She watched them from a distance for a moment and felt something that was not quite named but was in the vicinity of the word family, which was a word she had handled carefully for years because it had always, until recently, denoted something she was outside of. The preserving operation ran its second full season with the adjusted pricing, and Berta's prediction proved accurate. The camps paid the higher prices without significant complaint because consistent quality at a known price was worth more than theoretical savings on an unreliable supply, which was a principle Evelyn had believed for years and was now watching prove itself in the revenue column. She hired 2 women from town to help with the preserving work in August, when the volume exceeded what she and Tomas could manage alongside the other ranch work. The women were both in circumstances she recognized, limited options, the particular alertness of people who have learned not to rely on anything they can't verify themselves. She paid them a flat weekly wage rather than a piece rate, because she had learned from her own history that piece rates created pressure to cut corners on quality, and she did not intend to cut corners on quality, ever, under any circumstances. She told them this directly at the outset. One of them, a woman named Rosa, perhaps 30, with 3 children and the kind of competence that had never been directed at something she owned any part of, looked at her carefully at the end of that first conversation and said, "You ran a house operation somewhere before this?" "No," Evelyn said. "I figured it out." Rosa looked at her for another moment. Then she put on her apron and went to work. And she was the most reliable of the two women, week after week. And by September, she was supervising the preserving line herself while Evelyn managed the accounts. Evelyn was 18 by August. She had been noting her own age more carefully since the previous year's birthday, the tin cup of wildflowers, because the years were beginning to mean something different, not longer but denser, packed with events she hadn't anticipated and changes she hadn't had time to catalog as they happened. She was trying to catch up with herself and finding, most days, that she was a few months behind. What she was behind on, specifically, was Gideon. Not behind on in any practical sense. The ranch ran with a coordination between them that had become almost frictionless, their individual competencies fitting together with the efficiency of two tools designed for adjacent problems, each one extending the range of what the other could do. That part she was current on. What she was behind on was the internal accounting of what she felt about it, about him, which she had been putting in a separate mental folder marked later for approximately 8 months, and which had, sometime in the summer, started insisting on attention. She had not had much experience with the particular problem of feeling things she hadn't budgeted for. Most of her emotional life had been about managing what was necessary and setting aside what wasn't, because setting things aside was how you got through days when getting through was the whole project. She'd done it so long it had become structural, and now there was something that declined to be set aside that kept turning up in the ledger of daily life. A look across the kitchen table, the sound of his voice in the yard, the way the whole shape of a day felt different if he was in it, and she was finding that she didn't have a good methodology for it. She handled it, for a while, by doing more work, which was her default response to anything that didn't have a clear procedure. She wrote the Drummond extension contract. She overhauled the cooperative's pricing structure. She wrote to Anders Brandt. They had maintained a correspondence since the hearing, she and Lena alternating letters with Evelyn, developing something that was becoming a genuine friendship, conducted at the distance of 45 miles. And she visited twice with Gideon, and those visits were easy in the way that time spent with people who had been through something alongside you could be easy. It was Lena who said it, on the second visit, in the kitchen while the men were outside looking at something in Anders's equipment shed. She said it the way she said most things, directly, without announcing that she was about to say something. "You know he's in love with you," Lena said. Evelyn looked at her coffee cup. "I know something," she said. "Do you know what you are?" A pause. "I'm working on it." Lena looked at her with the particular expression of a woman who had been married for 20 years and had thoughts about the subject. "Don't work on it too long," she said. "Some things get worse with more thinking." Evelyn looked up. "That's not advice I've historically been able to use." "I know," Lena said. "I'm giving it anyway." She thought about it on the ride home. 45 miles was a long time to sit beside someone and not say something, and she could feel the weight of not saying it, the particular density of things held back. Gideon drove and looked at the road and was quiet in his way. And the miles went by, and the sun went down ahead of them, and the sky turned the colors. It turned in October, the ones that felt like they were trying to say something in a language you almost spoke. She didn't say it that night. She said it 2 weeks later, on a Sunday, when there was nothing pressing and the ranch was quiet, and they were sitting on the porch in the last of the afternoon warmth, with the account books closed for once, doing nothing in particular. She said, "I think I've been in love with you for a while and I've been filing it somewhere and the file is full." She said it looking at the pasture, not at him, because she had a limit on vulnerability and looking at him while she said it was past it. There was a silence. Long enough that she started to run contingency calculations, the old habit of preparing for outcomes, and then he said, "Since when do you think?" She considered the question seriously, because it was a serious question, and he'd asked it in a way that meant he wanted the real answer. "Sometime in the spring," she said. "I think. It was gradual. I didn't notice it arriving." "I noticed mine arriving," he said. "It was before spring. It was February. You came back from the Brandt family with the copy of the statement and you put it in the ledger and you said, 'The record does the asking,' and I—" He stopped, started again. "I thought, there is not another person like this. I've never met anyone like this." She was quiet for a moment. She turned to look at him and he was looking at her, and whatever was in his face was not new. She recognized it now, could trace it back through months of looks filed away under later. But it was no longer being held back, and seeing it clearly was different from carrying the impression of it secondhand. "I was 16 when you found me in that barn," she said. "I need you to know that I understand what I am now is different from what I was then." "I know that," he said. "I built most of what I am here," she said. "I didn't come with it. And I need the thing between us to be about who I've become, not about the girl you let out of the barn." He looked at her steadily. "The girl I let out of the barn told me she wasn't going back to Hartwell House," he said, in the same tone of voice you use for everything else you've decided is going to happen. "She was already who you are. She just had less material to work with." She sat with that. It was possibly the most she had ever heard him say at once, and it had the quality of something he'd been carrying for a while and had chosen now to put down. "All right," she said. "All right," he said. It was not a dramatic moment. It was a porch in October, and the air smelled of cold coming and turned earth, and they were two people who had been building something together for over a year and had just agreed in the plainest possible terms that the building included this. She did not feel swept away or transformed. She felt clarified, like a column that had been carrying an unrecognized entry finally balanced. She reached across and put her hand over his on the porch rail. He turned his hand and held hers, and they sat like that for a while, looking at the pasture, not saying anything else. Because what was there to say that the silence didn't already hold? The town did not transform either. This was one of the things she had learned, that change in a community happened the way change happened in soil, below the surface and across seasons, and the surface looked the same long after the underlying composition had shifted. Ash Hollow Crossing was not a different town than the one that had locked her in a barn 14 months ago. The same families lived there, the same hierarchies and gossip channels, and comfortable convictions about who was worth respecting and who wasn't. What had changed was the available evidence for those convictions. Vivian Cross she saw at intervals, at the Mercantile, at Dora's, once on the road into town. Their encounters had the careful quality of two people who had decided, independently and for different reasons, that the hostility was more expensive than the distance. Vivian looked at her sometimes with something that wasn't exactly respect, but wasn't contempt either. More like the recalculation of a person who has made a bet on someone being nothing and watched them become something and is revising, privately, without wanting to admit the revision publicly. Evelyn did not need the admission. She had never been interested in Vivian's opinion of her, only in being outside Vivian's reach, and that problem had been solved so thoroughly and with such finality that she rarely thought about it, except when they were physically in the same space. What she thought about instead was the next thing, which was always the next thing. The next thing, in November, was a letter from the Territorial Authority. It was a formal letter, official seal, the language of bureaucratic acknowledgement that managed to be both precise and nearly opaque, but the substance of it was clear. The investigation into Harold Cross's practices, initiated by their complaint, had been completed and the findings were incorporated into the permanent Territorial Land Registry record. Harold Cross had been formally censured at the territorial level, and the censure was a matter of public record that would attach to any future land dealings he attempted. She read this at the kitchen table, and then she read it again, and then she sat with it for a while. The censure was not imprisonment. It was not the full accounting for everything Harold Cross had done. To the Brants, to the family that had left the county, to the families whose names she'd found in the registry records, and whose stories she'd never been able to fully reconstruct. The mechanism of formal authority was not capable of accounting for all of it, and she had known this from the beginning, from the moment Calloway had told her that a single adverse ruling was not the end of anything. But it was a record, permanent, public, attached to his name in the official documents of the territory. Anyone who looked would find it. Anyone who dealt with him would know it existed and could find it if they chose to look. The story of what he had done was now in a place where it could not be easily revised or forgotten. She thought about the chain on the barn floor, the chain she had refused to put on, the document she had carried against her skin from the magistrate's office back to the ranch, the second ledger filled with dates and descriptions and witness signatures, all of it pointing to this, truth, fixed in the record, immovable. That was what she had actually been doing for 14 months. Not winning, recording, making sure the real version of events had a place to live that was harder to demolish than memory. She folded the letter and put it in the locked box with the other permanent documents, and she went to find Gideon. He was in the equipment shed, working on the wagon axle with the focused attention he brought to mechanical problems, which was the same attention he brought to everything but directed through his hands rather than through speech. She stood in the doorway and told him about the letter, and he listened without stopping work, which was the way he processed things, continuing the physical task while the other part of his mind turned over what he'd been told. When she finished, he put down the wrench and looked at her. "Is it enough?" he asked. She thought about the question seriously. "For the land? Yes. For everything else?" She leaned against the doorframe. "No, but enough for the land. Then it's enough for what we needed it to be." "Yes," she said. "It is." He picked up the wrench again. "Tomas found a loose section on the north fence line this morning," he said. "He marked it with a stake already." She looked at him. There was something in the shift, from the letter and its weight to the fence line and its stake, that was not dismissal but completion, the way he moved from a thing that was done to the thing that came next. She found she appreciated it. There was a whole life beyond the resolution of Harold Cross, and they had always both known that, had been building it simultaneously with the fight, which was the only way to build anything when someone was trying to take it away from you. "I'll go look at it this afternoon," she said. "I'll come with you," he said. There was a particular afternoon in December that she returned to often afterward, not because it was dramatic, it wasn't, but because it contained something she wanted to keep. Tomas was at the north fence. Rosa and the other woman had finished the last of the preserving work for the season and gone home. The snow had started, the first real snow of winter, coming down in the particular thick and purposeful way that said it intended to stay. Evelyn was at the kitchen table with the account books, the year-end accounting, the thing she did each December to see what was real. And Gideon was at the stove making something that smelled like the beef and potato stew he made on cold evenings, which was not refined cooking, but was warming and sufficient, and something she had come to associate with the particular feeling of being inside when it was cold outside. She was looking at the column for the preserving operation, the full year's revenue, which was more than twice the previous year's because of the adjusted pricing and the Drummond extension. And she was thinking about what the number meant in practical terms, which was that the ranch was no longer behind. The debt from the years before she arrived was gone. The operation was generating enough to invest in next year's seed stock and still have a margin. It was not wealthy. It was not comfortable in any way that would have satisfied the Cross family's definition of the word. But it was stable, which was a different thing from comfortable, and she had learned more durable. She put her pen down and looked at the numbers for a moment without adding to them. Behind her, she heard Gideon set a bowl on the table, and then she heard him read over her shoulder. He did this sometimes, reading the columns without commenting, because he had come to find the numbers legible in the way she'd hoped he would, and because shared understanding of what was real was something she valued in a partner more than she would have known to ask for before she had it. "That's real," he said, which was what he'd said about the first mining camp letter, a year and a half ago, and she remembered it. "It's very real," she said. He sat down. She closed the account book. The stew was in front of her, and she picked up her spoon and they ate in the silence that was theirs. The particular quality of quiet between two people who have said what needs saying and are content with what's in the rest of the space. "Tomas asked me this morning," Gideon said, "whether he was staying through the winter or if he needed to find something else." She looked up. "What did you tell him?" "I told him it wasn't just my decision." She considered. She thought about the fence stake and the inventory columns, and the way he was with the horses, not performing care but genuinely extending it, the way some people were built to do without having been taught. She thought about the 14-year-old standing on the porch saying he was 16, and the decision he'd made to tell her something true even when it cost him. "He stays," she said. Gideon nodded. "That's what I thought you'd say." "Then why didn't you just tell him?" "Because it wasn't just my decision," he said again, simply, and returned to his stew. She sat with that for a moment. The fact of it, the principle embedded in it, the way it was so completely unlike every household arrangement she had ever observed or lived inside. "Because it wasn't just my decision," said without ceremony or self-congratulation, the way you stated a fact that was simply true. She had built something real here. That was the thing she kept returning to. Not the legal victory, not the revenue column, not even the resolution of Harold Cross, but the dailiness of what she'd built, the texture of this specific life. The table she sat at, and the account books on the shelf, and the stew in the bowl, and the man across the table who would come to find her at the pasture edge to tell her about a letter, and who said, because it wasn't just my decision, the same way he said everything, as if it were simply obvious. She thought sometimes about the girl on the barn floor, the chain in her lap, the counting of breaths against the cold. She thought about that girl not with pity, exactly. She didn't think pity was what that girl would have wanted, and she knew her well enough to be confident of that, but with something more like respect, for the refusal to put on the chain, for the choice to wait for an unknown rather than accept a known that would have broken her, for the way she'd looked at Gideon Blackridge in the lamplight and seen something the town's story didn't account for. You could say she'd been lucky. She knew people would say that, did say it. Evelyn Mercer, who got lucky when the rancher came back to his barn. And there was truth in it. There was. She knew what the alternative of his not returning looked like, had traced it often enough. She did not argue with the luck. But luck was the beginning of the story, not the whole of it. Luck put Gideon in his barn doorway with a lamp and a bolt cutter. Everything that came after, the document folded against her skin, the account book filling up through spring and summer, the letters and the cooperative and Callaway and the ride to see the Brants and the filing to the territorial authority. That was not luck. That was a 17-year-old girl who had been doing this specific kind of arithmetic since she was 9, applied to the first problem in her life that was actually worth solving. She thought about what she would tell someone in a barn floor right now. Someone young and cold and locked in the dark, believing this was the shape of everything. She thought about what she knew that she hadn't known then. She would say, the story they tell about you is not you. The limits they've decided on are not limits. The people who use your circumstances against you are counting on you to accept their accounting, and you don't have to. You can keep your own books. She would say, find who is honest and hold on to that. Honest is rarer than capable, rarer than kind, and it's what you build on when everything else is unreliable. She would say, write things down. The truth has to live somewhere, and it might as well live somewhere that can be found. She would say, it is possible, improbable, difficult, requiring more patience than feels survivable, but possible to build a life from the worst possible starting point. Not a smooth life, not a life without cost, but a real one, with real things in it. She would say all of this knowing that the girl in the barn could not use any of it yet, because the only way to know it was to live through the process of learning it, which could not be shortcut or transferred. You had to do the work. You had to stay in the cold and wait for the variable you couldn't control and make the best decision available to you with whatever you had in your hands. The snow outside was coming down with more intention now, thickening against the window pane in a way that said tomorrow would be white and slow and requiring of its own kind of work. Tomas would be back from the fence line soon, cold and probably hungry, and she would need to tell him he was staying. The seed order for spring was sitting in the desk drawer waiting for her final review. Drummond's contract extension needed one more signature and then it was done. The year-end account book sat closed in front of her, showing a real number in the right column. Real in the way that she had learned was the only kind that mattered. Gideon was across the table, finished with his stew, looking at the window and the snow with the particular expression of a man who was thinking about tomorrow's work and finding that, on balance, he was willing to do it. She reached across the table and put the account book on the shelf where it lived, and she thought, this is what it looks like. Not the dramatic version, not the triumphant version, not the version where everything is resolved into something clean and legible. The real version. 2 people at a kitchen table in December, with a locked box of documents under the bed, and a field resting under snow, and a 14-year-old on his way back from the fence line, and a stew pot that needed washing, and a spring order that needed signing, and years ahead of them that would have their own herald crosses and their own bad nights, and their own problems requiring documentation and patience, and the willingness to keep going when keeping going was all that was available. She would take it. She would take all of it. Tomorrow, she said, I want to start on the spring planning, the east field rotation. I know, he said. I've been thinking about it. What are you thinking? He told her. She listened. She disagreed with part of it and said so, and he considered her disagreement and adjusted one element and held firm on another. And they went back and forth on the east field rotation while the snow came down and the lamp burned on the kitchen table between them. And it was not perfect, and it was not finished, and it was, without question, the best thing she had ever built. Outside, the Blackridge Ranch sat in the gathering snow. The south pasture and the east field, and the equipment shed with its repaired roof, and the fence lines that ran clean and intact to the horizon, both names on the deed, the record in the locked box, the cooperative that was still growing, the contracts that were still running, the territory-level censure that would attach to Harold Cross's name in the official record for as long as official records lasted. All of it real. All of it built. All of it, at its origin, the consequence of a girl who refused to put on a chain. The lamp on the table burned warm and yellow against the dark, the way it had every evening since the previous January, when Evelyn Mercer had walked out of a frozen barn and decided, in the particular way she decided everything, quietly, completely, without announcing it, that she was not finished yet. She had been right about that. She was right about most things, in the end, when she had enough time and enough information and enough material to work with. And now, at last, she had all three.